Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. It was nearly midnight when I found myself driving down a long, deserted stretch of road. The kind of road where the trees seemed to reach out like dark fingers, the pavement cracked and uneven in places. I'd been on the road for hours, trying to get home after a weekend trip to visit some old friends, and the isolation was starting to get to me. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional flicker of my headlights illuminating the shadows. The silence was broken by the sound of a car engine behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car passing by, but when I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw a dark silhouette that seemed to be getting closer. The headlights were off, which struck me as odd, especially on a road this dark and isolated. I squinted trying to make out the vehicle's shape, but all I could see was the outline of a car, steadily creeping closer with every mile. I felt a sudden jolt of unease. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the driver was just another late-night traveler like me, but the more I thought about it, the stranger the situation seemed. I accelerated slightly, hoping to put some distance between myself and the car behind me. But the moment I sped up, so did they. The gap between us didn't widen, in fact, it seemed to close with every passing second. A knot tightened in my stomach as I pushed the accelerator harder, my foot pressing down without thinking. The engine roared in protest, but the car behind me stayed on my tail. I glanced in my mirror again, my heart racing. There were no headlights, no visible signs of the car's make or model. It was like a shadow on the road, silently stalking me in the dark. I began to wonder if I was being paranoid, but then I noticed something that made my pulse spike. As I sped up, the car behind me kept pace, its dark outline drawing nearer with every mile. It was as if the driver was purposefully tailgating me, trying to stay just a few feet from my rear bumper. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and my mind raced for an explanation. Maybe the car's headlights were broken. But then why hadn't they been turned on? And why was this car tailgating me, even when I was clearly speeding up to get away? The isolation of the road seemed to amplify the sense of danger. I was alone out here, no nearby towns, no streetlights, just endless darkness stretching out in front of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The car behind me didn't just follow, it mimicked my every move. The more I tried to outrun it, the closer it got, matching my speed exactly. I checked my speedometer, over 80 miles per hour now, and yet the car was still right behind me, close enough that I couldn't see any details, just the outline of its body. My anxiety began to surge, and I had to force myself to focus on the road ahead. I knew I had to do something. This was no coincidence. Someone was tailing me, intentionally, in a way that felt deliberate and sinister. I slammed the brake pedal down, hoping to throw the car behind me off, but it didn't work. The car didn't slow down. In fact, it got even closer. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I made another desperate move, swerving my car to the side of the road and pulling over, hoping to let the mysterious driver pass. But the other car followed suit, pulling up behind me, never once turning on its headlights. I could feel my breath catching in my throat as I sat in the car, frozen. What did they want? Why were they following me? I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. As the phone rang, I looked out the window, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the other car. But there was nothing. The car behind me remained in place, just sitting there in the dark, its shape barely visible against the shadows. The 911 operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation, my voice shaky. They told me to stay on the line and to remain in my car until help arrived. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the dark outline of the vehicle behind me. It was like it was waiting for something, but I couldn't figure out what. Every few seconds I would glance in the mirror, trying to make out any details, but the darkness kept it hidden. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. My hands were slick with sweat, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, all of them terrifying. Had I made a wrong turn somewhere? Had I picked up a tail without realizing it? But why hadn't the other car moved? Why didn't they just pass me or leave me behind? Then, without warning, the car behind me's engine roared to life. It wasn't just idling anymore, it was moving, slowly at first, and then faster, heading straight toward me. I panicked, slamming the gear shift into drive and peeling away from the shoulder of the road. My heart skipped a beat as the car began to follow me again, its dark shape drawing closer. I pushed my foot to the floor, adrenaline surging through my body. I could hear the tires screeching as I took the curve too fast, the car behind me keeping pace, gaining on me once again. But this time I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to let this shadow get any closer. The headlights of my car illuminated the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the other car's headlights were right behind me, invisible and menacing. My hands were shaking as I kept my grip tight on the wheel, weaving in and out of the dark curves in the road. Each time I glanced in my rearview mirror, the car was right there, only a few feet away. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but eventually I saw a distant glow up ahead, lights, streetlights, signs of civilization. A small town, a gas station. The moment I saw it, I made a sharp turn off the road and into the station's parking lot, my tires screeching in protest. I threw the car into park and jumped out, looking around frantically. But the car with no headlights was gone. I couldn't see it anywhere. My heart was still racing, and my breath was ragged as I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the 911 operator's voice breaking through the tension. "Are you okay?" she asked. I swallowed hard, my voice still shaking. "I'm fine, I think I lost them." But it wasn't normal. There was something wrong with that car. Something wrong with the way it was following me. The operator didn't say anything for a moment, just listening to the quiet. "I'll send someone to check the area," she said. "Just stay there and stay alert." I nodded, my mind still trying to make sense of the night's events. The car with no headlights had been tailing me, getting closer with every turn I made. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Story 2. I had just finished a long day at work, the kind that drained you both physically and mentally. The drive home was uneventful, the streets empty except for the occasional car. My mind was preoccupied with thoughts of dinner and what to watch on TV. It wasn't until I pulled up to my house that a strange feeling washed over me. The moment I stepped out of my car, something seemed off. The air felt heavier than usual, and there was a strange stillness to the evening. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I was overthinking things, but something tugged at me, telling me to be cautious. I dismissed it as paranoia and walked up to my front door. As I reached for my keys, I noticed something unusual. The door, which I was sure I had locked before leaving, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I double-checked my keys in my pocket, wondering if I had forgotten to lock it in my rush. But no, I was certain I had locked it. I had always been meticulous about it. The door wasn't wide open, but it was enough to make me pause and take a step back. A wave of unease washed over me as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar warmth of my home should have been comforting, but instead, the quiet felt unsettling. I locked the door behind me, my eyes scanning the living room. Everything looked normal at first, but the longer I looked, the more things seemed out of place. My heart began to race as I took a few steps further into the room. The couch, which I distinctly remembered leaving against the far wall, was now facing the opposite direction. The coffee table was a few inches to the right, just enough to make me question my memory. It wasn't a huge change, but it was enough to make me feel like I was seeing things. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that maybe I had moved the furniture earlier without thinking. But no, that didn't make sense. I would have remembered moving the couch, especially after a long day at work. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting from one piece of furniture to another. The bookshelf, which I always kept in a specific corner, had been shifted slightly as well. It wasn't much, just enough to make the books on the shelf look off-center. I walked over to it, my fingers grazing the spines of the books. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, someone who had been careful not to take anything but had rearranged everything just enough to make me feel uncomfortable. I checked the rest of the house, moving from room to room, but nothing seemed to be missing. The kitchen was untouched, the bedroom still had the same unmade bed I had left behind that morning. Everything was where it should have been except for the furniture. It didn't make sense. If someone had broken in, why hadn't they taken anything? Why would they only move things around? I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It was as if someone had been inside my home, just moments before I arrived, and was now hiding, waiting for me to make a mistake. I rushed to my bedroom and checked the closet, then under the bed, but there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, just a strange rearranging. Still, I couldn't shake the paranoia gnawing at my mind. I walked back into the living room and stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. It wasn't just the furniture that had me unsettled. It was the fact that I had been sure I locked the door. The door hadn't just been unlocked, it had been left open a crack. That meant someone had been inside after I had left for work. The thought made my skin crawl. I had always prided myself on being cautious, always double-checking the locks before I left. And yet, here I was, standing in my own home, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I decided to check the door again. Maybe I had just been too tired when I left this morning and I had forgotten to lock it. But as I turned the handle, I felt a jolt of panic. The door was locked. I checked the deadbolt, it was secure, just as it should have been when I left. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the tightness in my chest didn't ease. I thought about calling the police, but for what? Nothing had been stolen, and there was no sign of anyone having been in my house except for the rearranged furniture. Still, the thought that someone had been here, moving things around for some unknown reason, made me uneasy. What if it was some kind of prank? But who would do something like that? And why? I called my best friend, hoping to make sense of it all. I described everything to her: the unlocked door, the rearranged furniture, the strange feeling that someone had been there. She listened intently, offering her own theories, but none of them seemed to make sense. "Maybe you're just stressed out from work," she suggested. "You've been working a lot lately. You could be overthinking things." But that didn't sit right with me. I wasn't just imagining it. I could still feel the unease pressing down on me. There was something off about the whole situation, something that didn't add up. After talking to her, I decided to go over everything one more time. I checked the windows, the locks, and the rest of the rooms, but everything was as it should be. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I went to bed that night with the uneasy thought that someone had been in my house, someone who had moved my things, leaving me with nothing but a strange, lingering sense of violation. I locked the door behind me and pulled the covers tightly around myself, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, they were still out there, watching. Story 3. I stood at the bus stop, a light drizzle falling from the gray sky, the quiet hum of the city surrounding me. The sound of distant car engines, the occasional chime of someone's phone ringing, and the shuffle of people passing by created a background noise that was almost soothing. I checked my watch, it was just after 6. The bus was always late at this hour, but it didn't bother me much. I had my headphones in, the familiar beat of my favorite playlist drowning out the rest of the world. It was then that I noticed him. A man dressed in a long dark coat standing just a few feet away from me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The bus stop was a common place for people to linger, especially at this time of day. He was tall, with an unkempt beard and dark, penetrating eyes. I caught him glancing at me once or twice, but I brushed it off as one of those moments where you accidentally make eye contact with a stranger. I was about to turn back to my phone when he suddenly stepped closer. I didn't even hear his footsteps, but there he was, right beside me. He wasn't particularly close, but close enough that I could smell something faintly unpleasant, like stale cigarettes and something metallic. His presence sent a chill down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back, feeling the cold air hit the back of my neck. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking to someone he knew intimately. "I know where you live," he said, his words sending an electric shock through me. I froze, unable to respond. The words were simple, but they hit with a sharp clarity that sent my heart into overdrive. It wasn't the kind of thing someone says just for attention, and it certainly wasn't a casual comment. It felt personal. It felt dangerous. My mind raced, trying to process the situation. Who was this man? How could he know anything about me? I hadn't seen him before, and I certainly hadn't given anyone my address recently. Before I could even gather myself enough to speak, he stepped back, his face blank, as if nothing had just happened. He didn't smile, didn't say anything else. He just turned and started walking away, as if our brief interaction had meant nothing at all. I watched him go, my body still frozen in place. He didn't look back. There was no hint of malice in his gait, just a casual, almost indifferent stride, as though he hadn't just dropped a bombshell on my evening. The rain started to fall harder, and I could hear the distant sound of tires on wet pavement. My mind swirled in a haze of confusion and fear. I had no idea what to make of the encounter. Should I have said something? Should I have asked him who he was or why he said that? But he was already gone, vanishing into the crowd of commuters, swallowed up by the gray urban sprawl. The sound of the bus approaching snapped me out of my daze, and I quickly boarded, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my fare. The ride home was long and uneventful, but every stop, every turn, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every pedestrian I saw, every car that passed, every face in the crowd seemed unfamiliar but somehow too familiar. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the same man following me, but the street was always empty. Still, the words he had whispered echoed in my mind like a broken record. "I know where you live." When I finally arrived at my apartment, the weight of the day settled on me like a thick, oppressive fog. I locked the door behind me and immediately checked every window, every door, making sure they were all secured. I hadn't noticed anything strange on my walk home, no one lurking in the shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I made myself some tea, hoping it would calm my nerves, but my hands were still shaking. I sat on the couch, the mug warm in my hands, trying to distract myself with the TV. But the man's words kept coming back to me. He hadn't said anything else, just those 5 simple words, but they carried an unsettling weight. How did he know where I lived? Had he been watching me for a while, waiting for the perfect moment to say something? Or had it been a random comment, something he said to everyone at the bus stop? I couldn't believe that. There was no way it was random. The intensity in his voice, the certainty in his tone, made it clear that he wasn't just some strange passerby. I stood up and walked over to the small window in my living room, peering out into the rain-soaked street. Nothing was out of the ordinary. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow on the wet pavement. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the darkness beyond the light. I pulled the curtains shut, feeling a small sense of relief, but it didn't last long. I knew deep down that the man's words would stay with me for a long time. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. I kept to myself, avoiding unnecessary trips outside, making sure my doors and windows were locked at all times. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing somewhere in the distance, watching me. But I never saw him again. It was as if he had vanished, leaving only the strange, lingering feeling of his presence behind. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a strange encounter with a person who meant no harm. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't shake the fear. I started making subtle changes to my routine. I switched up my path to the bus stop, avoided walking the same streets at the same time of day, and even began taking a different bus altogether. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched never truly left. One evening, nearly a week later, I received an unexpected package. I hadn't ordered anything, and there was no return address. Hesitant, I opened it. Inside was a single, crumpled piece of paper with the same 5 words written on it: "I know where you live." My heart sank into my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random encounter. Whoever had spoken those words to me had found a way to track me down, and they weren't done yet. Story 4. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale orange glow across the sky as I laced up my running shoes. The early morning air was cool and crisp, a perfect contrast to the humidity that would set in later in the day. I was used to the quiet solitude of these early runs, the only sounds being the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the gravel path and the distant chirping of birds welcoming the new day. It was my escape, my time to think and clear my head before the world started demanding anything of me. The trail I ran on was well maintained, winding through a dense thicket of trees and eventually leading to a small clearing. I had taken this route countless times, so the familiar turns and landmarks felt like second nature. My breathing was steady, and I found myself slipping into a comfortable pace, my mind wandering to the tasks ahead of me. That was until something caught my eye. As I rounded a corner, my gaze shifted downward, and I saw the gleam of metal embedded in the dirt. At first, I thought it was some kind of tool or trash someone had carelessly left behind, but as I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a knife, shiny black and ominous, with the blade buried halfway into the earth, almost like it had been intentionally placed there. A chill ran down my spine. I slowed to a stop, staring at the knife for a moment, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't just any knife. It looked sharp and clean, the kind you might find in a kitchen drawer or a survival kit. But who would leave a knife like this out here, in the middle of the woods? And more importantly, why? I hesitated for a second, then crouched down to inspect it further. As I reached for the hilt, I noticed a small piece of paper tied to the handle with a string. The note was weathered, as if it had been there for a while but still legible. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, the words printed neatly but with a strange urgency. "Next time." I stared at the words, my mind spinning. Who had written this? What did it mean? I glanced around, but the trail was empty, the surrounding woods silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. There was no one in sight, no footprints in the dirt, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here recently. The knife in the note felt like a message, but a message for whom? I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the area once more, my heart starting to pound in my chest. The air felt heavier now, as if the world around me had shifted in an instant. It wasn't just the knife, it was the note. The words themselves were a warning, a promise of something to come. But what? Was this some twisted joke, or was someone out there watching me, waiting for me to make my next move? The feeling of being watched intensified, and I took a step back, my legs tense and ready to run. I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone anymore. The idea that someone had been here before me, that they had left this knife and note for a reason, made my skin crawl. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with this information, or if I should even tell anyone. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling the whole situation became. I considered leaving the knife there, walking away, and pretending I hadn't seen anything. But the note gnawed at me. Next time. What did it mean? Was it a threat? A warning? A clue to something bigger? I felt like I was standing on the edge of something just out of reach, but I couldn't turn away. I bent down again, picking the knife up carefully by the handle, my fingers tightening around it. It was surprisingly light, but still, holding it felt wrong, like I was holding something dangerous, something that didn't belong in my hands. I stuffed the note into my pocket, and without thinking, began jogging back down the trail, my pace quicker than before, as if the words on the note had triggered some primal instinct to flee. The further I ran, the more my mind raced. Who had left the knife there? And why had they singled me out? I tried to dismiss the thought, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that I was overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. This wasn't just a random encounter, it felt personal, like I was part of something I didn't understand. I arrived at the clearing a few minutes later, breathing heavily, my body tense. The world around me felt different now, darker, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I didn't know why, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I had just crossed some invisible line, that I had been marked in some way. The note, the knife, this wasn't over. Whatever it wasn't over. When I reached the parking lot, I finally stopped and glanced around, looking for anything out of place. The car park was empty, save for one lone vehicle parked near the edge. My car was the only one there, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. But that didn't ease the unease gnawing at me. In fact, it made it worse. Someone had left that knife for a reason, and the message couldn't be ignored. I tossed the knife into the back seat of my car and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind unable to shake the thought of the words on that note. Next time. What did it mean? Was it a warning? Or was it a threat? And if so, was I in danger? The engine roared to life as I pulled out of the lot, my eyes darting around, checking the mirrors obsessively. But there was no one behind me, nothing but the empty trail winding off into the distance. And yet the sense of being followed, of being hunted, remained, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I couldn't stop thinking about the note. Next time. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the last time. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning. Story 5. I woke up from my nap with a groggy sense of confusion. The soft afternoon light filtered through the blinds, and the quiet hum of the apartment felt unusually still. I stretched, rubbing my eyes, and reached for my phone, expecting to check a few messages or notifications. The screen lit up with dozens of missed alerts, but one thing caught my attention: the photos. There were over 30 photos in my gallery. They were all taken in the same spot, my living room, where I had been napping. I froze, staring at the screen as I swiped through each image, my pulse quickening with every passing photo. Each one was a close-up shot of me sleeping on the couch, my face relaxed in deep rest. I hadn't taken any of these photos. I lived alone, and my phone was the only one I ever used. I held my breath as I scrolled through the pictures. Each one seemed to capture a different angle, different moments in my nap. The lighting shifted slightly in each photo, but the scene remained the same: me, peacefully asleep on the couch. The images were clear, detailed, far too clear for a simple accidental snapshot. It was as if someone had been sitting there watching me sleep, snapping pictures one after another. I felt my stomach twist with unease. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had taken them and forgotten. Maybe I had asked a friend to snap a few for strange reason, and I had just blocked it out. But even as I thought that, I knew it wasn't true. These photos weren't taken by me. There was no way. And I had been completely alone in my apartment when I fell asleep. I stood up and paced around the living room, my phone still clutched tightly in my hand. My thoughts were racing, and the feeling of being watched, of being exposed, crept over me. I checked the front door and the back door to make sure they were locked. Both were. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to push through the dizziness. There was no logical explanation for the photos, no rational reason for how they could exist. I swiped through the photos again, this time paying closer attention. Some of the shots were from a high angle, others from an almost ground-level perspective, as though someone had been kneeling beside me. The timing between each photo was too precise, too deliberate. The only explanation that made any sense was that someone had been in my apartment, had taken the photos while I slept, and then had somehow left without a trace. The thought made my skin crawl. My apartment wasn't particularly large, and I had lived here for a few years. There were no secret rooms, no hidden passages. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing that seemed out of place. I had locked all the doors when I came in, and there were no windows open. So how had someone gotten in? I quickly checked the rest of my phone, hoping to find some kind of clue, some explanation. There were no other strange messages, no evidence of someone else using my phone. My apps were as I left them. It didn't make any sense. Whoever had taken the photos hadn't used my phone in any other way, only to capture those disturbing images of me. A shiver ran down my spine as I considered the possibility that someone had been watching me sleep. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, a primal fear that gnawed at my thoughts. How long had they been there, waiting, watching me? Had they been in the room for hours, standing so still that I never woke up to their presence? The idea was horrifying, and my mind raced to imagine all the possibilities. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. But it was hard to ignore the fact that I had no memory of anyone being in my apartment. I had woken up alone, as I always did. The photos were still on my phone, mocking me with their silent presence. I wondered if I should call the police, if I should tell someone about what had happened. But what could I say? Someone took photos of me while I was sleeping. How would I even explain that without sounding crazy? I sat back down on the couch, feeling defeated. My hands trembled as I tapped through the photos one more time, my eyes scanning every single one for any clue, any tiny detail that might offer a shred of an explanation. But there was nothing. The photos were too clear, too deliberate, as if someone had carefully orchestrated each shot. And the thought of someone having that kind of access to my life without me knowing was too much to bear. I took a deep breath and started to delete the photos one by one, but something stopped me. A sense of unease. A small voice inside my head told me to stop, told me to keep them, just in case. What if there was something in these photos, something I hadn't noticed yet? What if deleting them erased my only proof? I put the phone down, my hands still shaking. The images of me sleeping stayed burned in my mind, haunting me long after I'd stopped looking at them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the person who had taken those photos was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night I left the lights on in every room. I double-checked every lock, made sure the windows were secure. But even then, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made my heart race. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my apartment as if for the first time. The silence was deafening, but in the back of my mind I kept hearing the click of a camera, the sound of someone capturing another image of me while I slept. I never found out who had taken the photos. I couldn't bring myself to look through my phone again, to investigate further. But the next time I went to sleep, I kept one eye open, listening for any sound that didn't belong, watching for any shadow that moved too quickly. The photos were gone, but the fear remained, and I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had taken those photos was still out there, watching. Story 6. The first time I noticed the rose, I thought it was a fluke. It was early on a Monday morning and I was heading to work. I reached my car in the parking lot, my bag slung over my shoulder, when I saw it. A single red rose, its stem slightly curved, resting delicately on the windshield. No note, no card, just the flower. It seemed out of place. I was used to seeing parking tickets or occasional flyers on my car, but a rose, that was different. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to make of it. Was it a mistake? Maybe someone had dropped it there by accident. I gently picked it up, cradling it between my fingers, and glanced around the lot, looking for any sign of the person who might have left it. But the lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars further down. I shrugged it off, tossed the rose into my car, and went about my day. By the time I returned to my car that evening, I had forgotten about the rose. But as I approached, my eyes caught the sight of it once again. Another single red rose, this one a bit fresher than the last, resting on the windshield. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly looked around again, but no one was nearby. I checked the other cars around me, expecting to see roses on their windshields too, but nothing. Just mine. Confusion settled in. Who would leave a rose on my car? I couldn't remember anyone giving me flowers recently, and certainly not on consecutive days. I picked it up, inspected it, but there was no clue, no note, nothing to explain it. I tossed it into the passenger seat and decided to just let it go. It was probably some odd prank, I thought. The next morning, as I approached my car, I stopped dead in my tracks. There once again was a single rose on my windshield. This time I felt a knot form in my stomach. It was too much of a coincidence. I didn't know anyone who would do something like this, and even if I did, I didn't think they would leave flowers for a week straight without saying a word. I checked my phone for any messages, any missed calls, but there was nothing. No one had contacted me. I stared at the rose for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. By the fourth day, I started to feel unnerved. The roses had kept coming each day, a fresh one. always on the windshield, always with no note, no indication of who might have left them. I began to wonder if someone was watching me. Had someone been following me home? It was a strange feeling, a creeping sensation that settled in my chest, like I was being observed by eyes that I couldn't see. But I couldn't prove anything. Every time I checked my car, there was no sign of a person nearby, just the rose. And I told a few friends about it, hoping they might offer some logical explanation. "Maybe it's just someone being nice," one of them said. "Maybe you've got a secret admirer." I laughed, but it didn't feel funny. It didn't feel nice. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. If it were a secret admirer, why wouldn't they just leave a note? Why didn't they show their face? Why the anonymity? It was all too strange, too deliberate. By the end of the week, I was no closer to figuring it out. The roses had kept coming every single day. The fresh petals, the long, slender stems, placed so carefully on my windshield. It had almost become routine now. Each morning I would expect to find one. And each evening I would feel that uneasy tension, wondering who was behind it, wondering if they were still watching me. That Friday evening, I decided to leave work late, hoping to catch whoever was behind this. I stayed at my desk, pretending to work long after the office had emptied. When I finally left, it was dark, and the parking lot was almost empty. I walked cautiously to my car, scanning the area, hoping to spot anything unusual. As I neared my car, I felt my pulse quicken. There, on the windshield, was yet another rose. I stood still, staring at it, feeling both relief and dread. No one was around. I looked over the cars again, trying to see if anyone was hiding nearby, watching, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadow. It was as if the person who had been leaving the roses was always one step ahead of me, always managing to slip away before I could catch them. I had to know who was behind this. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day I decided to take action. I arrived at work early and parked in the farthest corner of the lot. I set up my phone on the dashboard, ready to record anything that might happen. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I needed some answers. I waited, nervously tapping my foot, glancing at the clock as the minutes ticked by. It felt like an eternity. At last, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw a figure approaching. It was dark, and I could barely make them out, but there was no mistaking their movements. They were walking slowly, deliberately. My heart started to pound as they got closer. I held my breath, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. The figure reached my car, and for a moment, I thought they had spotted me. But they didn't. They reached up, placed the rose on my windshield, and walked away. I waited for what felt like hours before finally getting out of the car to approach the spot where the figure had stood. There were no footprints in the dirt, no indication of where they had gone. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. I ran my fingers over the rose, feeling its softness, the way it had been placed so carefully. There was no note, nothing. I never did find out who had been leaving the roses, and eventually they stopped appearing. The flowers ceased, and the mystery faded into the background of my life. But every time I walked to my car in the mornings, I would glance at the windshield, half expecting to see a rose there. And sometimes, in the stillness of night, I would swear I could feel eyes watching me, waiting for me to notice. Story 7. I was staying at my friend Rachel's apartment while she was away for the weekend. She had asked me to look after things while she took a short trip out of town, and I'd agreed, knowing it would be a nice change of scenery. The apartment was cozy, tucked away in a quiet part of the city, and I enjoyed the solitude. I spent the day lounging around, catching up on books I'd been meaning to read, and cooking a simple dinner. By the time the evening rolled around, I was ready for bed, the peaceful surroundings lulling me into a sense of comfort. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up suddenly, disoriented and confused. My mind was foggy, and for a moment, I wasn't sure why I had been pulled out of sleep. The apartment was completely still, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room. I glanced around, trying to shake off the sleepiness, but then I heard a faint sound from the front door. Someone was jiggling the handle. The noise was subtle at first, just a soft click and rattle of metal, like someone testing the door. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell if the person was trying to break in or if they had simply made a mistake, but I was frozen, too afraid to move or make a sound. I held my breath, hoping the noise would stop, hoping that whoever it was would just go away. But then the handle rattled again, and I could hear someone outside, shifting their weight, almost as if they were waiting to see if the door would open. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The apartment was supposed to be empty, except for me. Rachel had made sure to lock everything before she left, and I had checked it again when I arrived. There was no reason for anyone to be outside, especially not in the middle of the night. A surge of panic rose in my chest, and I reached for my phone on the bedside table, but my hands were shaking too badly to unlock it. I could barely breathe, the fear settling heavily in my chest. Then, as if sensing my tension, the noise stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. No footsteps, no jiggling of the handle, just an eerie silence that filled the apartment. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, but the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I waited, hardly daring to move, my eyes fixed on the dark shadow of the door across the room. I wasn't sure how much time had passed before I heard it again. This time the jiggling of the door handle was accompanied by soft footsteps, deliberate, slow steps, as if the person was testing the ground beneath them. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever was out there didn't seem to be in a hurry. They were taking their time, as though they knew no one was around to stop them. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my body suddenly alert. I decided I needed to make some noise, to let the person know I was awake and inside. I wasn't sure what else to do. I had to make them realize that they had been caught. So I reached for the lamp beside the bed, flicking it on with a sharp click. The sudden light illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The footsteps stopped immediately. I held my breath, waiting for any reaction, but nothing came. The silence stretched, long and unnerving, as I sat frozen on the bed. It felt like an eternity passed before I finally heard it, the soft, retreating sound of footsteps moving away from the door. The person was leaving. Whoever they weren't interested in coming inside anymore. I didn't move for several more minutes, listening carefully for any other sounds, but all I could hear was the quiet hum of the apartment's air conditioning. I felt my heartbeat slow, but the fear didn't completely dissipate. I wasn't sure if I should get up, check the door, or call the police. My mind was a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. Finally, I gathered the courage to get out of bed. I crept toward the door, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. As I approached, I could see the faint outline of the lock through the cracks around the doorframe. Everything seemed in place. No one had gotten inside. Still, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. What had just happened? Who had been outside, and why had they tried the door in the first place? I stood there for a moment, deliberating. Should I check the peephole or look through the window? Should I call Rachel, or would that just make me sound paranoid? My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I hesitated, unsure of what I might find on the other side. I didn't want to open the door, not knowing if the person was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Instead, I decided to lock all the windows and doors in the apartment. I went from room to room, double-checking the locks, feeling the anxiety bubbling inside me with each click. The apartment, which had felt like a safe haven just hours before, now felt cold and foreign. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to make their move. What if they came back? After securing everything, I returned to the bedroom, my mind still racing. I lay back down in bed, trying to calm my thoughts, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing every creak in the building, every gust of wind outside, wondering if it was the person from earlier. What if they were just waiting for me to let my guard down? The thought was almost unbearable. I managed to drift off to sleep a few hours later, but it wasn't restful. Every noise woke me, and I was constantly checking the door, as though expecting someone to show up again. The night dragged on, and when morning finally came, I was exhausted. I immediately called Rachel, explaining what had happened. She was as startled as I was, but reassured me that the apartment had never had any issues with intruders before. Still, she promised to have someone check the locks and security systems when she got back. As I walked out of the apartment later that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my personal space, someone who knew exactly when I would be alone. The jiggling of the door handle, the quiet retreating footsteps, it was all so deliberate, so unnervingly calm. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't feel safe in that apartment anymore, even though the door had remained locked all night. Whoever had been outside, I knew they hadn't given up. They were still out there, somewhere watching and waiting. Story 8. It had been one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong. I had spent hours running errands, dealing with the usual mess of daily life. By the time I finished, I was tired and irritable, just wanting to get home and forget about the long list of things I had to do. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, relieved to be almost done with the day, and parked my car in the far corner. The lot was empty except for a few other cars, and the streetlights cast long, soft shadows across the asphalt. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed something unusual on my windshield. At first, I thought it might have been a flyer or a ticket, but there was no logo, no official markings. Instead, a small, crumpled piece of paper was tucked neatly under the windshield wiper. I frowned, walked over to it, and carefully removed it. The paper felt thin, almost fragile, and I unfolded it to find a short message scrawled in dark ink: "You've been chosen." I stood there, staring at the words, trying to make sense of what I was reading. The phrase didn't make any sense. Chosen for what? I looked around the empty lot, half expecting someone to step out from behind one of the cars and explain it away as a prank. But no one was around, and the lot was eerily quiet, as though the world had paused. I glanced at the paper again, but it was just as strange and cryptic as before. No other context, no explanation, just those 3 words. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was a prank or some weird marketing gimmick. People could be odd sometimes, and I had no time to waste on this nonsense. But a small part of me, the part that always thought something strange was lurking around every corner, felt a little uneasy. I stuffed the paper into my pocket and headed toward my building, trying to shake the odd feeling creeping over me. The elevator ride up to my apartment felt longer than usual. As the doors opened on my floor, I stepped out into the hallway, but the sense of unease still lingered. I couldn't get the words out of my head. "You've been chosen." It kept replaying in my mind, as if the phrase was trying to tell me something important. But I had no idea what. It didn't help that my apartment was at the end of the hall, far from the elevator, and the quietness of the building seemed to amplify my growing discomfort. I fumbled with my keys as I reached my door, feeling strangely paranoid. The hallway lights buzzed faintly above me, and I felt as though someone might be watching from the shadows. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped inside, I tried to calm myself. There was no reason to let a silly note freak me out. I set my bag down and moved toward the kitchen to make a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would help me relax. The tea didn't help. I spent the next few hours trying to focus on anything other than the note, but I couldn't. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the feeling they stirred in me. Something was off. It was like I was being pulled into something I didn't understand, and I didn't want to find out. As night fell, I kept the lights on, and the television played in the background, but my mind wasn't on the show. My thoughts kept drifting back to the note. I eventually went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside my window felt amplified in the quiet of the night. I tossed and turned, thinking I heard footsteps outside my door or faint murmurs coming from the hall. It was probably just my imagination, but it felt so real, so immediate. I finally drifted off, though the uneasy feeling never left. The next morning, I woke up to an odd sensation in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't a feeling of fear, but more like something was about to happen, and I had no control over it. I tried to push the thought away, but it kept returning. I took a quick shower and tried to shake off the weirdness of the previous day. Maybe I was just tired. I had a busy schedule ahead, so I didn't have time to dwell on it. As I left for work, I noticed something strange. The parking lot was busier than it had been the day before. Several cars were parked along the rows and people were walking between them, heading into the building. I glanced at my car as I passed, but it seemed completely ordinary. Then, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A small folded piece of paper was tucked under my windshield wiper again. I stood frozen for a moment, feeling the same sense of dread from yesterday creep back over me. It was the same paper, the same message. You've been chosen. It was impossible. How could this be happening again? My mind raced, trying to figure out who would do such a thing. Who would go out of their way to leave these messages for me? I hesitated before grabbing the paper. I wanted to leave it, to pretend like it wasn't there. But the urge to know what was going on overpowered me. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the note, hoping for some kind of explanation. But there was nothing new, just those same 3 words, "You've been chosen." No context, no explanation. I looked around the parking lot, but no one seemed to be paying attention to me. It was as if everyone else was in their own little world, completely oblivious to what was happening. I drove to work in a daze, my mind reeling. It didn't make sense. Why me? Why was I being chosen for something I didn't even understand? My thoughts spiraled as I went through the motions of the day. The note haunted me, and with every passing hour, the unease grew. It was like something was waiting for me to uncover, but I didn't know what. That evening, when I returned home, the parking lot was quiet again, and the building was shrouded in the soft glow of the streetlights. As I walked to my car, I paused. There was no note this time, no piece of paper under the windshield wiper. For a split second, I felt a strange sense of relief, but it was fleeting. I hadn't realized how much I had been expecting the note until there wasn't one. The absence of it left me feeling even more unsettled, like something was missing, as if the universe had shifted slightly and I had no idea how to find my footing again. Later that night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. I fell asleep quickly, but when I woke up, I was no longer in my apartment. The room I was in was unfamiliar, and the walls were painted a dull gray. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, realizing that I wasn't alone. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure watching me. It was a man, tall and shadowed, his eyes fixed on me. "You've been chosen," he said, his voice low, almost mechanical whisper. I froze, unable to move or speak. The words I had read on the paper echoed in my mind, but now they had a new meaning, and I realized with chilling clarity that I had no idea what I had been chosen for. Story 9. I stepped out of the elevator, my tired eyes adjusting to the dim hallway light. The building was quiet, as it usually was in the late evening, and the air felt unusually heavy. I was eager to get inside and unwind after a long day of work, but as I approached my door, something felt off. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there shouldn't have been anything unusual waiting for me, yet my instincts told me otherwise. The door was slightly ajar, which immediately made my heart race. I was sure I had locked it when I left. I pushed the door open with a shaky hand, and my eyes immediately fell on the floor. There, leading from my front door all the way down the hallway to my bedroom, were muddy footprints. Thick, dark prints that looked fresh, and they seemed to be left in a deliberate pattern, as if someone had walked slowly across the floor. I took a step back, my mind racing with confusion and fear. I hadn't been outside that day. I hadn't even opened my balcony window. There was no way I could have tracked mud into my apartment. And yet, here they were, muddy footprints that led straight to my bedroom door. I scanned the hallway behind me, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning. I stepped cautiously into the apartment, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The strange trail of footprints seemed to be mocking me as I followed it, the weight of each step feeling heavier than the last. My stomach twisted with unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own home. I looked around, my eyes darting to every corner, every nook where someone could be hiding. But the apartment was empty, no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing that would explain the muddy prints. The trail led me down the hallway, past the kitchen, and toward my bedroom. My breathing was shallow as I neared the door. The footprints had stopped right at the threshold, as though the person had entered my room and then disappeared. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the doorknob. It turned with an almost imperceptible click, as though the door had been recently opened. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside filtering through the blinds. At first, everything appeared normal. My bed was untouched, my desk clear of clutter, and yet something felt wrong. I couldn't place it, but there was a strange stillness to the room, a sense of lingering presence. My eyes scanned the room, moving from the corner where the window was to the closet door that stood slightly ajar. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I took a few cautious steps toward the window, peering out into the darkness of the city below. There was no sign of movement in the alleyway below. The street was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. I turned back to the room, my eyes landing on the closet door. I hadn't opened it this morning. In fact, I rarely did unless I was looking for something specific. I approached the closet, each step more reluctant than the last. My hand rested on the door handle, and I hesitated. I could feel my pulse quickening. There was something about the situation, something about the footprints and the door being ajar, that made my instincts scream at me to leave, to get out. But my curiosity held me in place. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. The inside was dark, the shelves filled with clothes, shoes, and boxes of old things I hadn't bothered to sort through in years. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something that stopped me cold, a small, muddy footprint on the carpet inside the closet. It was the same dark brown as the ones in the hallway, and it was fresh. The print was too small to be mine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was intentionally placed, as though someone had stood there and watched me. I stepped back, my heart racing as a cold wave of dread washed over me. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could someone have been in my apartment without my knowledge? I had locked the door when I left, and I had come straight home, no detours, no stops along the way. The only explanation was that someone had somehow gotten inside while I was gone, and I hadn't noticed until now. I moved back into the hallway, my eyes scanning the apartment once again. The silence felt heavier than before, as though the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting. I quickly went to the kitchen and checked the door that led to the balcony. It was locked. I checked every window, every possible entry point. Everything was secure. But the footprints, they didn't make sense. Who had left them, and why? I stood there, feeling a strange sense of being watched, a tingling sensation running up my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right. I went back to my phone, calling my best friend, hoping to find some reassurance. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I left a voicemail asking them to call me back, my voice trembling slightly. My thoughts raced as I sat on the couch, still staring at the muddy prints leading to my bedroom. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to follow them, but I couldn't bring myself to go back in there. Minutes passed like hours, and I finally decided to call the building's management office. I needed to find out if anyone had accessed my apartment. Perhaps there had been maintenance or someone working on the building's plumbing. But when the manager answered, they told me there had been no work scheduled for the day and no one had entered the building besides the tenants. With my heart pounding, I sat in my living room, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still in the apartment, someone who knew I was there. The muddy footprints seemed to stretch out endlessly in my mind, like a trail leading deeper into something far darker than I could understand. Story 10. I had stayed later than I intended at the office, finishing up a few last-minute tasks that seemed insignificant earlier in the day, but had somehow become pressing as the hours dragged on. By the time I stepped out into the parking lot, the streetlights flickered dimly against the growing darkness, and the silence was almost suffocating. The evening air was cool, and the wind whispered through the empty lot, making the shadows dance in the corners of my vision. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and glanced over at my car, parked far from the entrance of the building, as usual. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few other cars scattered here and there. As I began walking toward my car, the eerie quiet of the night settled around me, making my footsteps sound louder than usual against the cracked pavement. My thoughts were preoccupied with the day's work, replaying conversations in my head, and I didn't notice how late it had gotten or how far I had walked until I heard it. At first, it was subtle, a faint sound that blended with the whispering wind. Footsteps. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the pavement behind me. I paused, not sure whether I was imagining it. It was a quiet night, after all, and any sound would seem louder in the stillness. But the footsteps persisted, slow and deliberate, echoing my own movements. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly turned around, scanning the lot behind me, but there was no one there. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. The parking lot was empty, the cars parked in their usual spots, all seemingly undisturbed. My eyes darted over the area again, and still no one was in sight. The streetlights buzzed quietly overhead, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of too many late nights and too much coffee. But as I turned back toward my car and took another step, the footsteps started again. This time they were closer, almost in sync with my own. My pulse quickened, and I quickened my pace, my footsteps growing louder and faster as I moved toward the car. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the lot remained just as empty as before. I could feel a growing sense of unease creeping up my spine. Someone was there, I was sure of it. But why weren't they showing themselves? I picked up my pace, the sound of my shoes slapping against the pavement mingling with the now unmistakable footsteps behind me. They were getting louder, more distinct with every passing second. I spun around again, my breath coming in short, panic gasps, but once again, no one was there. It was as though the footsteps had simply vanished into thin air. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and the sensation of being watched gripped me tighter. I had to get to my car. Whatever this was, whatever trick my mind was playing on me, I needed to escape it. I moved even faster now, practically jogging toward my car, my eyes darting nervously over my shoulder every few steps. But as soon as I started moving again, the footsteps started again too, keeping perfect pace with my own. They followed me like a shadow, not stopping, not faltering. My breath was shallow, and panic began to claw at my chest as I neared my car. The footsteps were so close now, almost as though someone was walking right behind me, their breath warm against the back of my neck. I could hear every step, every shift of their weight, but when I whipped around once more, the lot remained just as empty as it had been. There was something deeply unsettling about it, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the footsteps, it was the fact that they seemed to have no origin. No one was there, yet they persisted, moving in perfect harmony with me. My car was only a few steps away now, and I moved faster, desperate to reach it. As I approached, I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, my fingers shaking with anxiety. I finally found the keys and unlocked the car with a quick motion, slipping into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut behind me. I looked through the windows, scanning the empty lot once more, but still, there was no sign of anyone. The footsteps had stopped as soon as I got in the car, but my heart was still pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I had just been too tired. Maybe it was all just a figment of my imagination. But then, as I sat there, I heard it again, faint at first, then growing louder. Footsteps. Someone was walking around the car. I froze, not daring to move, my breath caught in my throat. My eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, but there was no one there, no one in the reflection. I couldn't see anything through the mirror except for the empty parking lot and the streetlights casting long shadows. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I shifted the car into drive. I didn't care how fast I had to go, I just needed to get out of there. I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires screeching against the pavement, my heart still hammering in my chest. The moment I was out of the lot, the feeling of being followed seemed to dissipate, but I couldn't shake the nagging sense that something had been there, something that I couldn't explain. For the rest of the drive home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone in the back seat or standing at the edge of the road. But the night was still, and the streets were empty. Even so, I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that I hadn't been alone back there. It wasn't just the footsteps, it was the sense that something or someone had been watching me. When I finally got home, I locked the doors and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure before I sat down on the couch. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I wasn't sure if I'd ever fully shake the memory of those footsteps, silent, persistent, always there when I turned to look. Story 11. I had just returned from work, tired from the long day and eager to relax in the quiet of my apartment. The hallway was empty, the air still, as I reached my door. I fumbled for my keys, the usual hum of apartment noises around me, footsteps, muffled voices seemed to fade as I focused on unlocking my door. But as I bent down to retrieve my mail from the small mat in front of my door, I noticed something unusual, a single Polaroid photo, face down, tucked under the crack. I froze for a second, a sudden chill sweeping over me. My heart beat a little faster, but I quickly brushed the thought aside. It was probably just some forgotten photo from one of the neighbors, or maybe something left by mistake. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers brushing against the glossy surface. When I turned it over, my stomach dropped. The photo was a Polaroid of me, unmistakably, walking into my building earlier that day. The image was blurry, but clear enough to make out my figure, bag slung over my shoulder, steps heavy as I walked through the entrance of the building. It had been taken from a distance, probably from across the street or from the shadows by the building entrance. My breath caught in my throat as I examined it closer. This wasn't just some random photo, this was a deliberate capture of my movements. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of the quiet surroundings. No one was in sight. My neighbors weren't coming or going, and the hallway seemed unnervingly empty. The thought that someone might have been watching me earlier that day made my skin crawl. I hurriedly unlocked my door, stepped inside and closed it behind me, locking it with a sharp click. I set the photo down on my kitchen counter, staring at it for a long moment. The image seemed innocuous at first, just a picture of me entering the building. But the more I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. How had someone known I'd be coming at that specific time? I was usually a creature of habit, but there was no way anyone would have known the exact moment I arrived, unless they had been watching me. I shook off the growing sense of unease and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. It could have been a neighbor playing a prank, or maybe someone with too much time on their hands. But something about the photo felt off. The fact that it was a Polaroid, an old-fashioned way of capturing a moment, made it feel even stranger, as if someone had gone out of their way to get it just right. I decided to call my friend Jessica, just to talk it out. I needed a second opinion. I dialed her number, the ringing seeming louder than usual in the otherwise silent apartment. When she picked up, I quickly explained the situation, detailing how I'd found the photo and what was on it. "That's creepy," she said after a moment of silence. "You're sure it's not just someone messing around? Maybe a neighbor or something?" "I don't know. It just feels deliberate, you know," I replied, my voice shaky. "I don't recognize the angle it was taken from. It doesn't seem like something a neighbor would do casually. It's too specific." Jessica's voice softened. "Do you think someone's been watching you?" I paused. The thought had crossed my mind, but I didn't want to say it out loud. "I don't know. But what if they have? What if they've been watching me for a while?" "Maybe you should call the police," she suggested, her voice serious now. "It doesn't hurt to report it. They might be able to trace the photo or find out who's been slipping it under your door." I guess. I hesitated. I didn't want to overreact, but at the same time, the idea of someone stalking me was terrifying. "I'll think about it. Thanks, Jess." After hanging up, I paced around the apartment, feeling the weight of the photo in my thoughts. I kept going back to the same question: how had they known when I was coming home? Could it be someone I knew? Someone who had access to the building, who had been paying close attention to my routine? I checked all the locks on my windows and doors again, even though I knew they were secure. The photo was still sitting on the counter, staring up at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had taken it was still out there, watching. I glanced over at the clock. It was getting late, and I knew I needed to try to sleep. But sleep felt impossible with the image of that Polaroid seared in my mind. As I lay in bed that night, I kept hearing small sounds, creaks, rustling coming from outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just the apartment settling, the usual noises. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photo again, me walking into my building, oblivious to the eyes following me from the shadows. The next morning, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I called the building's management to ask if anyone had been in the building recently, trying to figure out if there had been any unusual activity. The manager assured me everything had been normal. No one had been reported hanging around the building, and there were no incidents to speak of. But something about their tone didn't sit right with me. I got the feeling they weren't telling me the full story. I went down to the lobby after hanging up and spoke to the doorman, asking him if he'd seen anything unusual. His response was equally dismissive. "No one's been hanging around," he said with a shrug. But his eyes flickered for a brief second, like he was hiding something. I left the building feeling more unsettled than ever. If no one had seen anything, then how had the person taken the photo? I started to consider whether I should take Jessica's advice and call the police. But what if they didn't take it seriously? What if they just dismissed it as nothing, like everyone else had? I decided to take matters into my own hands. I carefully examined the photo once more, looking for any clues that might tell me who had taken it. There were no obvious signs or distinguishing marks, just me walking into the building. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew something about me, something I hadn't even realized. That night, I checked my phone and social media accounts looking for any strange activity. Nothing stood out. But deep down, I felt as though the photo was just the beginning. Someone had been watching me, and the thought made my skin crawl. As I locked the door to my apartment and turned off the lights, I couldn't help but wonder how many other times they'd been watching without me knowing. The photo was still on my counter, but now it felt like a warning. Whoever had left it under my door knew more than they should, and I had a sinking feeling that I hadn't seen the last of them. Story 12. I stood in the dimly lit lobby, waiting for the elevator. The building was mostly empty at this hour, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft click of the elevator buttons breaking the silence. It had been a long day, and I was eager to get home. The weight of the day pressed down on my shoulders as I tapped my foot, half listening to the quiet sounds of the building around me. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and the doors slid open. I stepped forward, but just as I reached for the button, I froze. A voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered my full name right behind me. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any whisper, it was my name, clear as day, and it felt like it came from inches behind my ear. I instinctively turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The space behind me was empty, the lobby silent except for the hum of the elevator. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. The lobby was as quiet as ever, with no one in sight. I didn't know whether to laugh at myself for getting spooked or to feel genuinely unsettled. No one had entered the building with me, and there was no reason for anyone to be in the hallway behind me. It wasn't like I had told anyone I'd be here tonight. I was alone, so how could someone know my name? I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft whoosh. My mind raced as I pressed the button for the top floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching me. I ran my fingers along the cool metal of the elevator's railing, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe the building's acoustics had played a trick on me. But no, the whisper had been so clear, so real. It was impossible to brush off. The elevator began its slow ascent, the soft hum of the machinery filling the silence. As the floors ticked by, I tried to distract myself by staring at the blinking numbers above the door. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the whisper. My name. Someone had called me and I had no idea who it was or why. The thought lingered in my mind, heavy and uncomfortable. When the elevator reached my floor, the doors opened, and I stepped out, my legs feeling heavier than usual. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and quiet. I walked briskly toward my apartment, my mind still spinning from the strange experience. It was a long walk down the corridor, and every creak of the building made me jump. I had never felt this paranoid before, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was just being overly sensitive. I fumbled with my keys as I reached my apartment door, my hands trembling slightly. My reflection in the shiny surface of the door caught my eye for a brief moment, and I quickly turned away. Something felt off about the whole night. I pushed the door open, eager to retreat into the safety of my home. As I stepped inside, I double-checked the locks just to make sure everything was secure. The apartment felt like a haven after the unsettling moments in the hallway. I went through my usual routine, throwing my keys on the counter, kicking off my shoes, and heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. I tried to shake off the lingering tension, but it wouldn't go away. The whisper kept echoing in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was no logical explanation for what had happened, and that was what unnerved me the most. I sat on the couch, sipping my water and trying to relax, but every small sound made me jump. The clock ticking on the wall seemed unnaturally loud, and the hum of the refrigerator felt like it was right next to my ear. The apartment, which had always been a place of peace, now felt suffocating. I glanced over at the hallway, wondering if I was imagining things, but the space beyond my living room was still and silent. The night dragged on, and I eventually decided to try and sleep. I turned off the lights, curled up in bed, and pulled the covers tightly around me. But no matter how much I tried to relax, the whisper remained in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, waiting for me to fall asleep. I kept my eyes closed, trying to ignore the creeping dread. But every time I thought I was almost asleep, my mind would replay the whisper. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise from the building made my heart race. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this nervous, this exposed. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired and imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as though the voice had left a mark on me, something that couldn't be erased. At some point, I must have finally drifted off, though I don't remember falling asleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to a strange feeling of pressure on my chest. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened my eyes, but there was nothing there. The room was dark and still, but that oppressive feeling lingered. It was as if something was waiting for me to acknowledge it, something that wasn't quite right. I sat up in bed, looking around the room, trying to shake off the eerie sensation. I was alone, I told myself. No one was there. But as I turned my head to look toward the doorway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was slightly open, just wide enough for someone to slip through. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. My heart hammered in my chest as I got out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a soft thud. I stood by the door, staring at the small gap, feeling like something was waiting for me on the other side. I slowly reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I pulled it closed. The apartment was still quiet, but the sense of dread remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was waiting for me to let my guard down. I locked the door, then checked every other door and window in the apartment, making sure everything was secure. My nerves were shot. There was no logical reason for any of this, and yet the events from earlier in the elevator kept circling in my mind. The whisper of my name still echoed in my ears, and the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it seemed to grow. Something wasn't right. I wasn't alone, not in the way I thought I was. Story 13. I was cruising down the familiar, tree-lined street on my bike, the wind rushing through my hair and the hum of the tires on the asphalt a soothing rhythm beneath me. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. I always took this route home, a quiet residential area that bordered a small park. The streets were usually empty at this time of day, with most people either at work or out running errands. It was peaceful, and I liked it that way. But today something felt off. As I pedaled past a row of houses, I noticed a van pulling up beside me, moving at the same speed. I glanced over, expecting to see someone who had maybe just missed their turn or was lost. But instead, the driver was staring directly at me. He was an older man with graying hair and a weathered face. His eyes, though, were intense, watching me with a strange, unsettling focus. "Hey there," he called out, his voice loud and eager. "You want a ride?" His words were abrupt, and there was a hint of something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. I kept my gaze forward, not wanting to make eye contact. It wasn't unusual for someone to offer a ride, but the way he said it felt different, almost too insistent. I shook my head quickly, hoping he would get the message. The van slowed down even further, matching my pace. "Come on, I'm just trying to help you out," the man continued, his voice drifting on the breeze. "It's a long way to wherever you're going. Just hop in, I'll give you a lift." I could feel my pulse quicken. There was something about his persistence that made me uncomfortable. I had never been one to trust strangers, especially not in situations like this. I pedaled faster, trying to put some distance between us. I wasn't far from home, and I knew the area well enough to be cautious of anyone who didn't belong. The van kept pace with me, its engine growling louder as the driver continued to call out, "Don't be shy. I'm just trying to help you. It's dangerous to ride your bike all alone out here." He laughed, but it sounded forced, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. My grip on the handlebars tightened, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. It was the way he said dangerous that made me uneasy. It was like he knew something I didn't. I took a sharp turn onto a narrower street, hoping that would throw him off, but the van followed. The driver wasn't letting up. "Come on, just pull over, and I'll give you a ride home. No reason to make this harder than it has to be." His voice was now laced with impatience, but there was a strange sense of calmness to it, like he had all the time in the world to follow me. I had to think fast. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced around, looking for a place to hide or something that might block the van's path. Ahead, I saw a small yard with a tall, overgrown hedge. It was a risk, but I didn't have many options. I could hear the van's engine revving behind me as I veered sharply off the road, cutting through the yard at full speed. The ground beneath my tires shifted as I hit the grass, and I pushed myself harder, feeling the strain in my legs. The sound of the van's engine grew fainter as I tore through the yard, but I didn't dare look back. I focused on the path ahead, zigzagging between trees and shrubs, hoping I could lose him in the maze of the yard. I had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I heard the van's tires screeching as it slowed down to a stop at the edge of the yard, but it didn't give up. I could hear the faint sound of the driver shouting, his words muffled but urgent. "Hey, where are you going? This is just a little shortcut." His voice was rising now, tinged with frustration. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just stop and talk to me." But I didn't stop. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my legs burned as I pushed myself harder, weaving through the trees and avoiding the thick patches of brush. I knew this neighborhood well enough to know that there was a small alleyway behind this yard that led to another street. If I could just make it there, I could lose him for good. I made my way toward the alley, the sound of the van's engine getting fainter with each passing second. But just as I was almost there, I heard the screeching tires again, followed by the sound of the van's engine revving once more. The man wasn't giving up. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, my body moving on instinct, my heart hammering in my chest. With one last burst of speed, I reached the alley and turned into it, not daring to look back. I could hear the van's engine growling in the distance, but it was getting quieter, as if the man had finally realized he wasn't going to catch me. I kept pedaling until my legs felt like they were about to give out, not stopping until I reached the main road. I slowed to a stop, my chest heaving with exhaustion, my hands trembling as I clutched the handlebars. I looked back, half expecting to see the van speeding down the street after me, but there was nothing. The road was empty, save for a few cars passing by. My heart was still racing, my body on high alert, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. I didn't let myself relax, though. I knew I wasn't completely safe yet. I kept looking over my shoulder as I continued my ride home, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if I hadn't made that sharp turn or found that yard to cut through. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just being paranoid, that the man hadn't meant any harm. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something off about the way he followed me, the way he wouldn't take no for an answer. By the time I reached my apartment, I was shaken but relieved. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, just to be sure. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his voice still echoing in my head, asking me over and over if I wanted a ride. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never ride that route again. Story 14. I had just settled in for a quiet night at home, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, with the dim glow of the TV lighting up the room. The house was eerily still, the kind of silence that made every small noise stand out. My phone had buzzed with messages from friends, but I hadn't felt like replying. I'd planned on spending the evening alone, catching up on a show I had missed over the week. As I sank deeper into the couch, a soft knock on the door pulled me out of my daze. At first, I thought it was a neighbor or someone mistaken about the house they were looking for. I paused the show, my curiosity piqued, but still, I hesitated. It was odd for anyone to show up at this hour. I was home alone, and the idea of answering the door to an unexpected guest left me feeling uneasy. I slowly got up and walked toward the door, peering through the peephole. There, standing on the other side, was a delivery man holding a large pizza box. My stomach dropped. I hadn't ordered any pizza. I double-checked the time and it was well past dinner, so I was certain I hadn't missed an order either. I opened the door cautiously, keeping my grip on the doorknob as I peered at the delivery man. He was wearing a standard pizza uniform, his face partially obscured by the cap and mask he wore. He handed me the pizza box with a polite smile, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, they seemed to wander toward the ground, like he was avoiding eye contact on purpose. "Here's your order," he said in a neutral tone, almost mechanically. I stared at him, confused. I didn't order any pizza. The delivery man nodded without saying anything, his eyes still downcast. He handed me a receipt, which I took without thinking. The receipt was strange. It was already paid for in cash, but there was no name on it. Instead, there was a set of instructions that made my blood run cold. Leave the door open. I looked up at him, about to speak, but before I could say anything, the delivery man turned around quickly and walked back to his car, leaving me with the pizza and the strange receipt. I stood there in the doorway, the cool night air rushing in as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced. Why would anyone send me pizza? And why the odd request to leave the door open? I closed the door behind me, locking it with a click, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I took a few steps back into the living room, staring at the pizza box on the table. I wasn't hungry, but I had to figure out what was going on. My fingers hovered over the lid of the box as I debated whether I should open it. My logical mind screamed that I should just call the restaurant and figure out what had happened, but something kept me rooted to the spot, as though I were waiting for something. I glanced at the receipt again. The instructions were scrawled in a hurried hand, but they seemed deliberate. Leave the door open. It was a simple request, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like an order. And why the pizza? It felt like a game one I was being forced to play, even though I didn't want to. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously opened the pizza box. Inside was a perfectly made pizza, still warm, with nothing particularly unusual about it. It wasn't the kind of pizza I would order, but it didn't seem tainted or wrong. I could see the steam rising from the hot cheese and pepperoni, but I wasn't in the mood for food. The more I looked at it, though, the more I felt like something was off. I picked up my phone and began scrolling through recent messages. I half expected one of my friends to have sent the pizza as some sort of prank, but there were no texts to explain it. No one had messaged me since earlier that day. I even checked my bank account to see if I had accidentally ordered it while distracted, but there was no charge for pizza. I took the receipt and dialed the number for the pizza place. A woman answered the phone with a cheery voice, but when I mentioned the pizza order, her tone immediately shifted. "I'm sorry, I don't have any orders for your address tonight," she said. "Are you sure it wasn't a mistake?" "But the delivery man brought it here," I replied. "He handed me the pizza himself, and the receipt says it's paid for in cash." "That's strange," she said. "We haven't received any cash orders for tonight." I could hear the confusion in her voice, and it only made the situation worse. I thanked her and hung up, now even more unsettled than before. The pizza still sat there on the table, its presence suffocating the room. I paced around the house, debating what to do next. Should I call the police? But what would I say? A pizza had been delivered, and the receipt had a strange instruction. It sounded insane. Then, as I passed the door again, I remembered the note. The part that had bothered me the most, the part that felt like a command. Leave the door open. I looked at the door again, my heartbeat quickening. I hadn't left it open. I had closed and locked it immediately. But the thought of it haunted me. What would happen if I followed the instructions? What if something was waiting for me outside? Was someone watching from the shadows, expecting me to obey? The tension in my chest grew tighter as I hovered by the door. I glanced back at the pizza. There had to be a reason someone would send me this pizza, and I had the nagging feeling that it wasn't just about food. I stepped toward the door, hands shaking slightly as I reached for the knob. Then I heard it. A soft scratching sound, followed by a knock at the door. I froze. It was too quiet at first, like a distant tap, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, more urgent. I had the overwhelming urge to look through the peephole, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My mind raced with questions, each one more ridiculous than the last. Who could it be? Was it the delivery man again? Someone I knew? I took a deep breath and stepped back, my mind made up. I wasn't going to open that door. I wasn't going to play whatever twisted game this was. I wasn't going to be part of it. But then, the doorbell rang. A single, sharp chime echoed through the quiet house. Story 15. I woke up to the cold morning air brushing against my face, an unfamiliar chill that immediately made me shiver. My eyes snapped open, and I instinctively pulled the blanket closer around me, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But as I blinked into the dim light of the early morning, I realized something was off. My bedroom window, which I had meticulously closed and locked the night before, was wide open. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound of the breeze rustling through the trees outside was the only noise in the room, but it was enough to make the silence feel deafening. I couldn't comprehend it at first. I was so sure I had checked every window before going to bed. I always made sure the locks were secure, the curtains pulled shut. It was a habit, almost a compulsion. So how could this have happened? I swung my legs off the bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window, the air growing colder with each step. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but part of me hoped it was just a mistake. Maybe I'd remembered it wrong, or maybe the lock had malfunctioned. But when I reached the window and saw the latch clearly undone, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I couldn't explain it. The window was wide open, the curtains gently swaying in the breeze as though someone had left it like that on purpose. The view outside was the same as it always was: the small garden, the trees lining the fence, but the sense of intrusion lingered. I stepped back, my mind racing through every possibility. Had someone broken in while I was sleeping? The thought sent a surge of panic through me, but I quickly pushed it aside. If someone had been in here, I would have heard something, wouldn't I? I would have noticed something out of place. I glanced around the room, searching for any signs of disturbance. The bed was undisturbed, the dresser in its usual spot. Nothing seemed out of place except for the window itself. I moved to the door, checking the lock, and it was secure. Everything else in the apartment was exactly as I had left it. No drawers open, no items misplaced. But still, the nagging feeling of being watched lingered in the air. It felt like something was wrong, like someone had been in the room, but left without a trace. I forced myself to go to the window and close it, locking the latch firmly. As I did, I tried to calm my breathing. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it, or maybe the wind had somehow pulled it open during the night. It wasn't impossible, though it seemed unlikely. But no matter how many explanations I tried to come up with, the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. It was as if someone had been there, and I hadn't known. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me. The quiet of the apartment was unsettling, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than usual. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. I wasn't normally paranoid, but this was different. This wasn't just a strange occurrence, it felt like a warning, a message that someone had been close, too close. As I sipped my coffee, I tried to convince myself it was just a fluke. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the window, or maybe I had been so tired the night before that I hadn't checked it properly. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an accident. I had lived in this apartment for a year, and I had always been careful about securing the windows and doors. So why would I forget to lock it now? I decided to check the rest of the apartment, searching for any signs that someone had been inside. I started with the back door, checking the locks, and then moved to the front. Everything seemed secure, but there was still something about the window that nagged me. It wasn't just the fact that it had been open. It was the fact that I hadn't heard anything, hadn't noticed anything unusual. If someone had entered the apartment, wouldn't I have heard the window opening? Wouldn't I have woken up? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, and the less sense everything seemed to make. I walked back into the bedroom, my eyes scanning the room again for any detail I might have missed. My gaze landed on the bed, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The blanket was slightly pulled to one side, just enough to make it look like someone had been lying there. But I hadn't moved it when I got up. I always made the bed after waking up, but today, the blanket was askew in a way that felt deliberate. My heart rate picked up again, my thoughts running wild. What if someone had been in the room while I was asleep? What if they had watched me? I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it wouldn't go away. The idea of someone standing at the foot of my bed while I slept, just out of sight, was enough to make me feel sick to my stomach. I checked the window one more time, even though I knew it had already been secured. It was just a habit, a way to reassure myself that nothing had changed. But when I looked outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the ground below the window, was a single, muddy footprint. It wasn't large, but it was distinct, and it was unmistakably fresh. I stared at the footprint for a long time, unable to move. Someone had been outside my window. Someone had been watching me. The fear that had been building in my chest now gripped me completely, and I knew that I wasn't imagining it. The window had been opened for a reason. Someone had entered my apartment, or at least had been trying to. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I leave the apartment? The thought of staying here, in this space where someone had violated my privacy, felt unbearable. But I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been outside might still be nearby, waiting, watching. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't ignore it. Whoever had been in my apartment had left a mark, a reminder that I wasn't as safe as I thought. And from that moment on, I would never look at that window the same way again. Story 16. The envelope was taped to my door when I arrived home from work, its plain off-white surface standing out against the otherwise unremarkable entrance. At first, I didn't think much of it. People often left things on my doorstep, a neighbor dropping off a package, or the occasional flyer for a local event. But something about this envelope felt different. It was taped with an unusual amount of care, the kind of precision that made it seem deliberate. My curiosity flared as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the paper. I tugged at the tape, peeling it off slowly, not sure what to expect. As I opened the envelope, I found it empty, except for a single photograph. My stomach dropped when I saw it. The photo was a close-up of the back of my head. I recognized my own messy hair, the worn coat I had been wearing that day. But what made my skin prickle with unease was the fact that it had clearly been taken from a distance. The perspective was too far for anyone to have been standing right behind me, and the angle was off, like the photographer was hidden somewhere, observing me without my knowledge. For a moment I just stared at the photo, feeling the weight of it sink in. Who had taken it? When had they taken it? I couldn't remember anyone being near me that day. I had walked home from the bus stop, barely passing anyone on the street. The unsettling thought that someone had been watching me, following me without my knowledge, made my breath catch in my throat. I quickly turned the photo over, hoping for some kind of clue, a name, a message, anything. But there was nothing, just the stark whiteness of the back of the photograph. I stood there, frozen in the dim light of my hallway, holding the photo between trembling fingers. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of prank? But it felt too personal, too deliberate. And who would take the time to find such a perfect moment to snap a photo without my noticing? The only thing I could think of was that someone had been tailing me, keeping track of my movements. The thought made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, My home, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The thought of someone being that close to me without me even realizing it left me feeling exposed. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was probably nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The photograph was too specific, too strange to just be a coincidence. I went inside and locked the door behind me, a sense of unease settling over me like a thick fog. I set the photo down on the kitchen counter, as if it were somehow safer there, and tried to distract myself. I made dinner, forced myself to eat, and flicked through channels on the TV. Though none of it held my attention, my mind kept returning to that photo, to the person who had taken it. It felt like an invasion, like someone knew something they shouldn't. Later that evening, I decided to take a walk around the block. I needed some air, something to clear my head. As I stepped outside, I scanned the street, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the pavement in the fading light. It was a quiet neighborhood with little foot traffic at that hour. Yet, as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. Every so often I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the street remained empty. The more I walked, the more I became convinced that I wasn't alone. The silence was oppressive, and the only sounds were the echo of my footsteps and the faint rustling of the leaves in the wind. My pulse quickened as I turned a corner, my eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I returned home, I locked the door behind me with a sense of finality. I hadn't seen anyone following me, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I checked the locks on all the windows and doors, and then, feeling an odd sense of comfort, I pulled the curtains shut. I couldn't explain why I was so unsettled, but the image of that photo, the way it had captured the back of my head, was burned into my mind. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed magnified. I kept picturing that person watching me, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. The photo had shattered my sense of security. It had made me feel like I was no longer in control of my own space. Someone had been watching me, someone who knew where I lived, knew my routine. It was a violation, and I couldn't figure out why it was happening. The next morning I went to work, trying to push the thought of the photo out of my mind. But the moment I stepped out of my car, I froze. My eyes darted around the parking lot, searching for anything out of place. The photo had made me paranoid, and now every sound felt amplified. Every movement seemed suspicious. I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. For the next few days, I kept an eye on my surroundings, but nothing happened. No more envelopes, no more photos. But the silence only made me more anxious. It was as if whoever had been behind it had disappeared, or worse, were just waiting for the right time to resurface. The photo had made me realize something I hadn't fully understood before: how vulnerable we are to those who watch from the shadows. It was a lesson I would never forget. Eventually, I gave the photo to the police, hoping they could find some clue that would lead me to the person responsible. They took it seriously, but there were no leads. The strange incident lingered in my mind, leaving a mark on my sense of safety. Whoever had been watching me was still out there, and I had no way of knowing when they would show up again. Story 17. I had just finished a long workout at the gym, the kind that left my muscles sore but my mind clear. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I made my way to the locker room to change. It was late, and the gym was almost empty, with only a few people scattered around finishing up their routines. I grabbed my towel from the bench and walked towards the row of lockers, glancing at the large mirror that ran the length of the room. That's when I saw it. In large block letters, someone had written my home address on the locker room mirror in what looked like black marker. The letters were bold, deliberate, as if the person had taken their time to carefully scrawl every number and street name. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. I stood there for a moment, staring at the address, trying to process what I was seeing. How did someone know where I lived? I hadn't shared that information with anyone at the gym, and there was no way it could have been a coincidence. I glanced around the locker room, half expecting to see someone watching me from one of the stalls or from behind the lockers. But the room was quiet, the air thick with the sound of my own breathing. I quickly walked over to the mirror, my hand instinctively reaching out to touch the marker writing. It was still wet, which meant it had been done recently. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Who would do something like this? And more importantly, why? My first instinct was to leave, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but something held me back. I couldn't just ignore it, not when my personal information had been so blatantly exposed. I checked the time on my phone, nearly 9:30 p.m. I was the only one in the locker room now, and that felt unsettling. I wasn't sure if I should take a photo of the writing for proof or simply erase it. But as I reached for my phone, the silence of the room seemed to press down on me, making me feel more exposed. I stepped back and glanced over my shoulder again, scanning the room for any signs of life. Nothing. The only sound was the quiet hum of the gym's ventilation system. My stomach turned as the realization set in. Someone had been inside the locker room recently. Someone who knew my address. Someone who had the audacity to write it on the mirror. I couldn't make sense of it. Who was this person? And what did they want from me? I quickly turned to the janitor's closet near the door, hoping to find some cleaning supplies to wipe the marker off the mirror. When I opened the door, though, the light inside flickered before coming on. There was nothing unusual about the closet, just a few mops, buckets, and cleaning solutions. But the sensation of being watched crept up my spine, and I hurriedly grabbed a rag and some spray cleaner. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had done this was still watching from somewhere, waiting for me to turn my back. I wiped the address off the mirror as quickly as I could, the cold metal of the locker room door creaking as it swung in the distance. My eyes darted back and forth between the mirror and the doorway. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The marker had come off easily enough, but the mark it left on my mind remained. As I finished cleaning, I tried to steady my nerves. I wanted to believe it was some kind of joke, that it was just an odd, random thing someone did for attention. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. The address wasn't just some random digits, it was mine. My full address, down to the exact street name. The odds of this being a coincidence seemed impossible. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror before leaving the locker room, trying to shake off the discomfort that lingered. My face looked pale, the worry lines on my forehead more pronounced than usual. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if someone had seen too much. The gym, which had always been a safe place for me to unwind, now felt like a cage. The idea that someone had been in the locker room while I worked out, leaving behind a message like this, was enough to make me feel paranoid. I decided to go straight home, but as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. My eyes darted over my shoulder every few steps, but no one was there. The streets were empty, the usual buzz of city life quieter than usual. I had to get home. I had to be safe. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and double-checked the locks, my hands still trembling. I tried to focus on something to distract myself, watching a show, reading, anything to take my mind off what had happened. But I couldn't. Every creak of the building, every shift in the air had my nerves on edge. My home address had been written on that mirror, and it wasn't just a random act of vandalism. Someone had done it with intent. I spent the rest of the night in a haze of anxiety, convinced that whoever had written the address on the mirror was still out there, watching. The next day, I contacted the gym to report the incident. The manager assured me they would review the security footage and investigate the matter, but something told me it wouldn't be that easy. The gym had cameras, but they were placed in common areas, never in the locker rooms themselves. Whoever had done this knew exactly how to stay out of sight. As the days passed, I tried to get back to my routine. I went back to the gym, though I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me every time I walked into the locker room. I was hyper-aware of every person around me, analyzing every stranger's behavior, trying to find any clues. But the feeling of being watched never quite went away. Whoever had written my address on that mirror knew things about me that no one should have known. It wasn't just a random prank. It was something much worse, something far more calculated. I still don't know who did it or why, but I can't shake the feeling that the person who left that message is still out there, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Story 18. It was a quiet evening, one of those nights where everything seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. I had been babysitting for the Harris family for a few weeks, and tonight was no different from any other. The kids, Emma and Luke, were already in bed, tucked under their covers, and I was sitting on the couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone. The house was warm and dimly lit, the sound of a clock ticking in the background as I let the hours pass. It was around midnight when I first noticed him. The street outside the house was still, save for the occasional car passing by. But there, under the flickering light of a street lamp across the road, stood a man. I squinted, trying to make out his features in the dark. He was tall, his coat blending with the night, but there was something strange about the way he stood motionless, staring at the house. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone or simply passing by, but as the minutes dragged on, he didn't move. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, it was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happened. I checked on the kids, making sure they were still asleep, and then I returned to the living room, my eyes occasionally drifting toward the window. The man was still there, standing like a statue under the street lamp, his gaze fixed in my direction. It made my skin prickle with discomfort, but I convinced myself that he was probably just waiting for a ride or taking a break. Nothing more. As the night wore on, however, my unease grew. It was now well past 1 in the morning, and the man had not moved. He remained perfectly still, his posture rigid and unchanging. I wondered if he had fallen asleep standing up, but the more I watched, the more it seemed like he was deliberately holding that position, unmoving. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a nagging sensation that told me something wasn't right. I walked over to the window, trying to get a better look. The street lamp cast long, distorted shadows on the ground, but the man's face remained hidden in the darkness. His body language was strange, almost unnatural. There was no sign of him fidgeting or shifting his weight. I tried to reassure myself again, telling myself I was overreacting. But the longer I watched him, the more I became certain that something was wrong. Why wasn't he moving? Why was he just standing there? I decided to call the parents, It was a bit excessive, I knew, but something in my gut told me to err on the side of caution. Mrs. Harris answered the phone, her voice groggy from sleep. I explained the situation as best I could, telling her about the man across the street. She assured me that it was probably nothing, that it was probably just a random person out late. But still, she promised she would check in with the neighbors to see if anyone knew him. Her voice remained calm, but I could tell she was concerned. She also told me to keep an eye on the kids and lock all the doors and windows. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I couldn't stop looking at the man who hadn't budged an inch. I could feel my anxiety mounting, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The kids were still sound asleep, oblivious to the growing tension in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. I pulled the curtains shut, but the sense of dread remained. The man was still out there, his figure burned into my mind. I must have stood there for a while, lost in my thoughts, when I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. I rushed to the window again, and this time I saw flashing red and blue lights reflect off the street. The police had arrived, their car parked a few houses down, and I could see them getting out and walking toward the street lamp where the man was standing. I felt a momentary wave of relief, thinking that the authorities would take care of the situation. But as the officers approached him, I noticed something chilling. The man didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge the officers as they got closer. They spoke to him, their voices raised, trying to get a response, but he stood there, staring blankly ahead. The police shone a flashlight on him, but his face remained hidden in the shadows. For a moment I wondered if he was deaf, or if he had some sort of disability that prevented him from responding, but something in the air told me that wasn't the case. There was something deliberate about his stillness, something unsettling. I watched as the officers attempted to gently guide him away from the street lamp, but he resisted, refusing to budge. After a few moments, one of the officers pulled out his radio and called for backup. Another officer, noticing the situation wasn't resolving itself, stood by, his hand resting on his weapon, his eyes never leaving the man. It was then that I saw the officer's face a mixture of confusion and concern. He was clearly uncomfortable, but he wasn't showing it. He had dealt with strange situations before, but this one was different. Minutes passed, and the officer seemed to be in some sort of silent standoff with the man. No one could understand why he was acting this way or why he wouldn't speak. Then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the man turned and walked away. The officers didn't chase him, didn't attempt to follow him as he melted into the darkness. It was as if he had been part of some strange, unspoken agreement to leave, and without a word he was gone. The police stood there for a moment, exchanging glances, and then slowly began to disperse. One officer came over to the house, knocked on the door, and spoke to me briefly. He asked if I had seen anything unusual, but I didn't know what to say. I told him about the man, how he had been standing there for hours, but the officer seemed uninterested, almost as if he had expected it. "We've had a few calls about him before," the officer said with a grim smile. "He's harmless, just odd. We've been keeping an eye on him for a while." With that, he thanked me and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stayed up for the rest of the night, watching the street from the window, but the man didn't return. The rest of the evening passed without incident, and eventually I fell into a restless sleep. The following morning, when Mrs. Harris returned, I told her everything that had happened. She was understandably concerned, but when I asked about the man, she just gave me a strange look and shrugged. "Yeah, he's been around for years," she said nonchalantly. "We all just keep our distance. The police know about him." But as I left the Harris house that night, I couldn't shake the memory of the man under the street lamp. What had he been waiting for? Why had he been standing there for so long without moving, without a single word? And why had the police treated him like something normal? Story 19. I pulled into the rest stop, the familiar glow of the fluorescent lights casting a dull reflection across the empty parking lot. It was late around 2 a.m. and the highway was quieter than usual. I was halfway through a long road trip and decided to stretch my legs, grab a snack, and recharge before getting back on the road. I parked near the edge of the lot, far from the few other cars that had scattered themselves across the spaces, eager for some peace and quiet. There was one car parked a few spots away, but it didn't seem unusual at first. The vehicle was a dull, dark color, nothing distinctive about it at all. I didn't even notice anyone inside as I climbed out of my car, feeling the cool night air on my skin. I glanced at the car again but saw no movement. The rest stop was unusually still, and the lights flickered slightly, making the parking lot feel like a forgotten corner of the world. I walked over to the vending machines and grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips, glancing back at the car every now and then. There was something odd about the stillness of it. No one got out of the car, and the lights weren't on. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just another driver taking a break like me. I didn't think much of it until I got back to my car. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I noticed that the dark car was still there. No one had moved. What? I backed out of my spot and began pulling out of the rest stop when I caught a glimpse of the headlights flicking on in my rearview mirror. At first I thought nothing of it, just another car coming to life after a rest. But as I turned onto the highway, I noticed the vehicle had followed me. It wasn't immediately alarming, but after a few miles I started to feel the weight of the situation. The car kept a steady distance behind me, its headlights a constant presence in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until I took a turn onto a quieter stretch of the highway that I started to feel uncomfortable. The car didn't break pace. It stayed a few hundred feet behind me, always just enough to make its presence known without being too close. At first, I told myself it was just another traveler. But the longer the car followed, the more I felt that eerie sense of being watched. It wasn't like the usual drivers you pass on the highway, wave to, and then forget about. This was different. I turned up the radio, trying to distract myself from the growing tension in my chest. I needed to focus on the road ahead and shake the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I kept stealing glances in the rearview mirror. The car was still there, maintaining that same unnerving distance. There was no way I could have mistaken it. The car from the rest stop was now tailing me. My heart started to race. After an hour of this, I began to panic. I was miles away from the rest stop, now in the middle of nowhere with nothing but dark stretches of highway and dense woods around me. I tried to remember the last exit I passed. There was no sign of a town anywhere nearby. My mind began to whirl with possible explanations, but nothing made sense. I'd been on the road for a while, and I couldn't recall seeing any other cars close enough to be following me. This car had been behind me since the rest stop. I considered speeding up, trying to lose it. I could feel my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, the palms sweating as I debated my options. But something told me not to, something in my gut that said speeding away would only make it worse. The car would only speed up too. I didn't want to make this a chase, but neither did I want to pull over and stop, even though I knew I couldn't just drive forever. I noticed the headlights in the mirror again. The car had adjusted to my speed perfectly, almost like it was waiting for me to make a move. I tried to take a different route, veering off the main highway, but the car followed me without hesitation. It was like it knew exactly where I was going. I made another turn, and then another, but no matter how many times I twisted and turned through dark, empty roads, the car stayed right behind me. I started to feel trapped. The once empty roads now seemed endless, and the night around me felt suffocating. I had no idea where I was, no landmarks to guide me, just an old highway winding through forests and fields. And behind me, the car, still there, waiting, watching. At one point, I considered pulling off into a small side road to see if I could lose it in the dark, but I didn't know where the road led. It was a gamble, and the risk felt too great. I didn't want to end up stranded in a place even more isolated. The car's headlights were still visible in my mirror, but it hadn't attempted to get any closer. It stayed a constant distance behind me, like a shadow. My mind raced through all the possible scenarios. Was it just a coincidence? Was this person simply driving the same route as me? Or was there something more sinister going on? My instincts screamed that this was no accident. The more I thought about it, the more I began to believe that the person in the car wasn't just driving, they were following me. I had become the prey, and they were the hunter. I decided that if I didn't do something soon, I might find myself in a situation that would be much harder to escape. I spotted an upcoming exit and took it, my car bouncing slightly as the tires hit the gravel road. The car behind me followed, just as I feared. I drove down the narrow, winding road and quickly came to a rundown gas station that looked like it hadn't been open in years. I pulled into the lot, hoping to get out of sight, but the car behind me pulled in as well. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was a blur of panic. I turned off my engine and watched the rearview mirror, waiting to see what the other driver would do. The car parked a few spots away from mine. There was no movement from inside. I sat there for a few moments, staring at the rearview mirror, afraid to even make a move. Finally, after what felt like hours, the car slowly reversed and turned around, driving back down the road. It disappeared into the night as quietly as it had appeared, leaving me frozen in my seat. I sat there for a long time, unable to move, until I finally took a deep breath and drove away, not looking back. I never stopped at another rest stop after that night. Story 20. The evening air was cool as I walked home from work, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in orange and purple. My feet moved automatically along the familiar route, the rhythm of my steps comforting after a long day at the office. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant sound of dogs barking. Everything felt normal, predictable until I saw it. I was walking past a street pole when something on it caught my eye. At first, it looked like a standard flyer. Advertisements for local services or missing pets were common around here. But as I got closer, I froze. There, taped to the pole, was a flyer with my face on it. I stared at the photo for a long moment, unable to process what I was seeing. It was a picture of me, taken a few months ago at a friend's birthday party, smiling and laughing. The words "missing person" were printed boldly beneath it, as if mocking me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and for a second, my mind raced with disbelief. I looked around, expecting someone to be watching me, some prankster, maybe a friend messing with me. But the street was empty, no one in sight. The flyer fluttered slightly in the wind, but it felt like the world had gone still, as if time itself was holding its breath. I reached up slowly, my fingers trembling, and pulled the flyer from the pole. My heart thudded in my chest as I read the rest of the words. Last seen at your address on Monday. It listed an address I recognized, a place I had visited only once, at a party a few months ago. I had been there, but I hadn't disappeared, at least not as far as I knew. The flyer seemed wrong, like a cruel joke. But as I stood there, the weight of it pressed down on me. My first instinct was to call the police, but then a thought crossed my mind: what if the police already knew about this? What if I was the one they were searching for? I pulled my phone from my pocket and glanced through the contact list. No one had called me to report anything unusual, but it felt like something had shifted in the air, like I was walking into a fog of uncertainty. I hurried down the street, the flyer still clenched tightly in my hand. The more I thought about it, the more the idea that I had somehow vanished seemed impossible. How could this be real? How could I be a missing person and not know it? My stomach churned as I imagined the confusion of my family and friends, thinking I had disappeared without a trace. The thought was absurd, yet here I was, holding this flyer in my hand as evidence of something that didn't make sense. By the time I reached my apartment building, I could feel the heaviness of the situation weighing on me, but I wasn't sure who to turn to. I didn't want to alarm my family or friends, not yet, not until I knew what was going on. But what if this was real? What if there was something bigger at play? I didn't know what to do next. I didn't even know where to start. I took the elevator up to my floor, the silence inside it pressing against my ears. The numbers on the display above the door seemed to tick by in slow motion, each floor passing with a growing sense of dread. When I stepped out into the hallway, I was careful not to look at my neighbors' doors, too aware of the way my mind kept racing, trying to come up with some rational explanation for the flyer, some way to make sense of the impossible. I fumbled for my keys and unlocked my door, stepping into the quiet of my apartment. The familiar smell of coffee and clean laundry greeted me, but it did little to calm the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I dropped my bag on the couch and threw the flyer on the coffee table, pacing around the room as I tried to collect my thoughts. Why had no one told me I was missing? I hadn't been in any accidents, hadn't been abducted or disappeared in any way. I had been going to work, hanging out with friends, living my normal life. But here I was, staring at a piece of paper that made it seem like I had vanished. I tried calling my best friend Jenna, hoping for some reassurance, but the call went straight to voicemail. She'd know what to do, I thought. She was always the level-headed one. I left a message, my voice shaking as I told her about the flyer. "Call me as soon as you get this," I said, and hung up, my mind still spinning. I needed to do something, anything to figure this out. I grabbed my jacket again and went back outside, clutching the flyer tightly in my hand. I walked back to the street pole, determined to figure out who had put it up. Maybe there was someone who had seen something, someone who could help me make sense of this bizarre situation. When I reached the pole, the flyer was gone. It had vanished. I stood there, staring at the bare space where the flyer had been just hours ago. It was as if it had never existed. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves on the ground, but there was no one around to explain what had happened. I looked up and down the street, but it was empty, no one in sight. It felt like I was trapped in some twisted dream, one that I couldn't wake up from. I went to the police station the next morning, flyer in hand, hoping they could shed some light on the situation. The officer who took my statement looked at me skeptically, asking questions I had no answers to. "Are you sure this is you?" he asked, pointing to the picture on the flyer. "We haven't received any reports about you being missing." His tone was calm, but there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes, as though I was the one acting strange. Of course it's me. I insisted, my frustration building. Someone put this up. I'm not missing. But someone seems to think I am. The officer nodded, making notes on a clipboard. We'll look into it. But right now, it seems like a prank. If anything changes, let us know. I left the station feeling no better than when I arrived. I had no answers, just more questions. The flyer was gone, but the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, never left. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and though I went through the motions of daily life, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. Someone knew something I didn't, and until I found out what it was, I wouldn't feel safe again. Story 21. It was just after midnight when I parked my car in the empty lot behind a convenience store. The lot was usually quiet at this time of night, the hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. I had finished my errands and was just trying to wind down a little before heading home. I leaned back in my seat, scrolling through my phone, mindlessly flicking through social media posts and news articles. The night felt peaceful, but there was something about the silence that started to feel unsettling, like I was alone in a vast, empty space. My headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the pavement around me. I could hear the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights from the store across the lot, but otherwise, everything was still. I tried to shake the strange feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. As I scrolled, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, not until the sound broke the quiet. The soft click of a car door handle. It was faint, almost inaudible, but sharp enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked up from my phone, my pulse suddenly racing. The passenger side door was shaking slightly, the handle moving as if someone was trying to open it. I hadn't seen anyone approach, and for a brief moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, without warning, the handle turned fully, and the door began to open. My breath caught in my throat, and instinctively I slammed my foot down on the horn, the loud blast shattering the eerie quiet. The door immediately jerked back shut, and I saw a shadow dart away from the car, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't waste a second. I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The car behind me had vanished from sight within seconds, but my heart continued to pound, a heavy thrum in my chest. I could barely focus on the road, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Who had tried to open my car door? Had they been planning to get in? My hands were still trembling as I turned down the next street, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being watched from somewhere just out of sight. I drove for a few more blocks before my heart rate finally began to slow. The calmness of the quiet neighborhood around me helped settle my nerves, but the unsettling thought of someone approaching my car without warning stuck with me. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure trying to get in, the way they moved so quickly after I honked the horn. It wasn't like a normal approach. There was something deliberate about it, as if they had been waiting for the right moment. I considered stopping at a nearby gas station to calm down and maybe take a few minutes to gather my thoughts, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I just wanted to get home. I had this nagging feeling that if I stayed in one place for too long, whoever that person was might return. Maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had been wrong, like I had narrowly avoided something worse. As I made my way toward my apartment, I kept replaying the event in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. I hadn't seen the person at all, just a vague figure near the door. They hadn't said anything, and they hadn't tried to knock or speak through the window. They had just gone straight for the door, like they knew exactly what they wanted to do. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. Maybe it had just been some random person who'd made a mistake. Maybe it was a prank. But deep down, I knew I couldn't convince myself of that. When I finally reached my apartment complex, I parked in my usual spot and sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the building's entrance. The lights in the lobby were on, and I could see a few people walking in and out, but the streets surrounding the complex were empty. I felt a little better, but the unease hadn't fully faded. I made sure to lock the doors before getting out, my eyes flicking around to check for anything unusual, any sign of someone lingering nearby. I walked quickly to my building, my keys ready in my hand in case I needed to defend myself. The last thing I wanted was to look over my shoulder the entire time, but I couldn't help it. Every little noise seemed amplified, like someone was following me, waiting for me to make a mistake. By the time I reached my door, I was practically shaking with the adrenaline still coursing through me. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, slipping inside as quickly as I could. Once the door was closed and locked behind me, I leaned against it for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. My apartment was quiet, just the way I liked it. The feeling of safety that usually came with being home now felt fragile, like it could be shattered at any moment. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and went straight to my phone, pulling up the parking lot security cameras. The camera footage from the convenience store was grainy, but I needed to check. Maybe I had missed something. I scrubbed through the footage, trying to see if I could spot anyone lingering around my car before I had gotten in. There was no one visible at first, but then I saw a shadow pass near the corner of the building, just a brief glimpse of movement. It was hard to make out details, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The figure had been there, watching. I replayed the footage several more times, hoping for something more concrete, but there was nothing else. No clear sign of who the person was or what they had been doing. It only left me with more questions. Why had they approached my car? What did they want? As I sat down on the couch, I realized I couldn't ignore what had happened. I didn't know who that person was, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to take any chances. Tomorrow I was going to make a report to the police. I didn't know if they could do anything, but I had to let them know what had happened. For now, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was safe, but deep down, I knew that whoever had been lurking outside my car hadn't gone far. And as I lay in bed, my mind kept racing. Had they been waiting for me? What would have happened if I hadn't honked the horn? I didn't want to think about it, but the fear lingered, quiet and persistent in the back of my mind. Story 22. I sat down at my desk after another long morning. The usual hum of the office around me. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, and the quiet clatter of keyboards filled the air. I had just finished a meeting and was trying to catch up on some emails when something caught my eye: a small USB drive sitting on the corner of my desk. It was odd because I didn't remember bringing it with me, nor did anyone else in the office seem to have left it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, wondering if it had somehow been misplaced by a coworker. The drive was unmarked, just a plain black stick, no name or label anywhere. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to plug it into my computer. Maybe it was a file someone had meant to give me, though it seemed strange they wouldn't have told me about it. The moment the USB was inserted, my computer recognized it, and a folder appeared on the screen. It was labeled with today's date, and curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the folder, and inside I found several video files, each named with different dates from the past few months. I opened the first video, not sure what to expect. The screen flickered for a moment, and then the video began to play. It was me walking out of the building one evening, just as I did every day. The camera angle was shaky, like it had been recorded from behind a window or from across the street. I could see myself walking briskly, probably heading to my car after a day at work. The timestamp on the video confirmed it had been filmed on a day I remembered clearly. But it was the fact that someone had been watching me, tracking me without me knowing, that made my skin crawl. I shut the video, my fingers trembling slightly. This couldn't be real, could it? I opened the next folder and clicked on another video. This time it showed me arriving at work, walking into the building at exactly the time I always did. I could see my reflection in the glass doors as I entered, unaware of the camera capturing my every move. The footage was clear, almost too clear, as if someone had been following me for much longer than I realized. I scrolled through the folders, opening each one, my mind racing. Every video was the same me going about my daily routine, walking in and out of the building. Some videos showed me coming back from lunch, others from my late-night work sessions. It felt like a montage of my life over the past few months, captured without my consent. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been watching me, tracking my every move, and I hadn't noticed a single thing. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood up, pacing around the small space of my office. This wasn't something I could ignore. Whoever was behind this knew everything about me, my schedule, my habits, my every move. I didn't know who could have done it, but the fact that they'd gone to such lengths to record me felt terrifying. The idea that someone had been so close, so watchful, and I hadn't had the slightest clue made me feel vulnerable, exposed. My thoughts raced as I considered what to do. I had to go to the police, right? But how could I explain this? How could I prove that these videos were real? There were no obvious signs that anyone had been in the office or near my desk. My office door was locked when I arrived in the mornings, and the only people who had access to it were my colleagues. But none of them seemed like the type to do something so invasive, so sinister. I took a deep breath and decided to open the last folder, hoping to find something, anything that could give me a clue as to who was behind this. But when I clicked on the final video, my stomach dropped. The video was different from the others. It wasn't of me entering or leaving the building. It was a close-up of my desk. The camera angle was from above, and it was focused directly on my chair, my keyboard, and my computer. There was no sound, just the visual footage of my workspace. I watched frozen as the video showed me typing emails, working on spreadsheets, completely unaware that someone had placed a camera above me, silently watching every move I made. The video cut to another shot of me leaving the office that night, but this time it was different. The camera zoomed in on the building from across the street, and in the background I could see a dark figure standing near the entrance, watching me as I walked out. The figure was blurry, but the chilling detail was unmistakable. They were watching me. I didn't recognize the person, but the feeling that washed over me was suffocating. Whoever had been filming me wasn't just observing from a distance, they had been close enough to get these intimate, unsettling shots. I felt a chill run down my spine and my mind raced. Who could have done this? And why? My first instinct was to delete the files, but I couldn't. I had to keep them as evidence, just in case. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whoever had left the USB drive on my desk knew I'd open it. They wanted me to see what they had been doing, to realize how long they had been watching me. It felt like a warning. I carefully unplugged the USB drive from my computer and locked it in my desk drawer, my mind still spinning. I had to get to the bottom of this, but I didn't know where to start. Could it be someone at work? A disgruntled coworker? Or was it someone from outside the office who had been watching me for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Whoever they were, I knew one thing for certain: they weren't done yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on my work, my thoughts constantly drifting back to the USB drive and the horrifying realization that someone had been stalking me, silently capturing every moment of my life. As I packed up to leave that evening, I made sure to check every corner of my office, every shadow, every hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me even now, just waiting for me to let my guard down. I couldn't ignore what had happened. I couldn't pretend that it was a simple misunderstanding. Whoever had done this was out there, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. But I was going to find out no matter what it took. Story 23. The morning air was crisp and fresh as I set out on my usual jog along the forest trail. It was a path I had run countless times before, winding through towering trees and over gentle slopes. The sun had just risen, casting soft golden light that filtered through the branches above. The rhythmic sound of my feet hitting the ground and the occasional chirp of birds was comforting, and I felt at peace, as I always did when I was out on the trail. The trail was mostly quiet this time of day, with only the occasional passerby. I passed the familiar landmarks: an old, twisted oak tree, a small creek that bubbled quietly under a wooden bridge, and a rocky outcrop where I sometimes paused to catch my breath. Everything was as it should be, and for a moment, I allowed myself to sink into the familiar routine, letting the world around me slip away. As I rounded a bend in the trail, something strange caught my eye. A tree up ahead stood out among the others, not because of its size or shape, but because of what adorned its bark. Stapled to the trunk of the tree were dozens of photographs, small, faded snapshots pinned haphazardly in rows. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't noticed anything unusual on my previous runs, and the sudden appearance of these photos seemed out of place, as though they had been there forever, but I had only just discovered them. I slowed to a halt and walked closer, my curiosity piqued. The photos were all of different people, each one captured mid-stride, jogging along the same trail I had been running. Some were close-up shots, others showed the runners from a distance. The images were grainy and worn, as if they had been taken over a long period of time. They were all tacked on at different angles, some crooked, some torn at the edges. It almost looked like a strange makeshift college. I leaned in closer to examine the pictures. Each one was a snapshot of someone I didn't recognize, and yet something about the familiarity of the trail they were on made it unsettling. There were runners in shorts, others in leggings, some wearing jackets against the morning chill. It was hard to make out their expressions, but many of them seemed to be looking straight at the camera, their gazes unsettlingly direct. The fact that they were all taken on the same trail made my skin prickle with unease. How had they been taken? Who had been watching us? I stepped back, glancing around to see if anyone else was on the trail, but there was no one in sight. The woods felt eerily quiet now, the sounds of the birds and rustling leaves seemingly muted. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What was the meaning of these photos? And why were they all pinned to this particular tree? Was someone following us? Or worse, had someone been watching us all along? I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. It was probably just some sort of prank, I reasoned. Maybe someone had been taking photos of people jogging for fun or as part of some art project. But even as I thought it, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The photos felt invasive, as if they were meant to serve as a reminder that someone knew exactly what we were doing and where we were doing it. I picked up my pace, deciding to keep moving rather than linger in one place too long. My eyes kept flicking back to the tree, as if expecting it to hold some clue or answer. I pushed myself to focus on the trail ahead, but my mind kept returning to the photos. Why had they been taken? Who had put them up? And how long had they been there? It was unsettling to think that someone had been tracking joggers, capturing their every move. As I continued along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My footsteps seemed louder now, and every rustling noise in the trees felt amplified. My breath came a little quicker as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the path was empty. The woods stretched out in all directions, silent and still, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I had just about reached the end of the trail when I saw something else out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing by the tree. My heart lurched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a man about my age, dressed in athletic wear, just standing there, staring at the photos on the tree. He didn't seem to notice me at first, his attention fixed entirely on the images, his posture rigid. For a moment I debated whether I should approach him or turn back. There was no telling who he was or what he was doing there. But before I could make up my mind, he turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't a friendly smile, it was almost knowing, like he had been waiting for me. I felt a chill run through me, and I instinctively took a step back. "Nice photos, aren't they?" he said, his voice calm, but there was an odd edge to it. "I've been coming here for a while now. They're all from the same place, you know." I nodded, unsure of how to respond, but I didn't want to stick around. Something about the way he spoke made me uneasy, as if he knew more than he was letting on. "Yeah," I managed to say. "I've been running this trail for years, but I never noticed them before." The man's smile widened just a fraction. "Funny how things can slip by you when you're not paying attention," he said, his eyes lingering on me for a moment, longer than was comfortable. "But you'll get used to it." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned quickly, my heart racing in my chest, and started jogging away from him. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me like a weight on my back. The images of those strangers, those runners who seemed to stare right into the camera, haunted my thoughts as I pushed myself to the end of the trail. When I reached the parking lot, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, my mind spinning with questions I didn't have answers to. Who was the man? How had he known what I was thinking? And why were there photographs of people jogging on the same trail, some of them so eerily recent? I glanced over at the woods, but the trail was quiet now. The trees swayed gently in the wind, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I would never look at that trail the same way again. Story 24. I had been driving for hours, winding my way down a lonely stretch of highway on a road trip that was supposed to be relaxing. The landscape outside my window was vast, almost desolate, with long stretches of flat land interrupted only by the occasional gas station or diner. I had left early that morning, and after a few stops for snacks and gas, I was starting to feel the weariness setting in. The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting everything in an orange glow as I made my way toward the next gas station. Pulling in, I noticed there wasn't much around, just a small, rundown station with faded signs. The gas pumps looked old, the kind that still had a crank to manually reset the meter, and the area had the kind of quiet that felt almost too still. I didn't think much of it at first. I had a few more miles to go and the gas gauge was running low. A quick refuel, a bathroom break, and I'd be on my way. As I stepped out of the car, a man who was standing near one of the pumps caught my eye. He was older, probably in his late 50s, wearing a faded red cap and a stained blue shirt. His face was lined with age, and his eyes had that hollow look that comes from too much time spent under the sun. He waved at me with a friendly smile. "Need any help, Mom?" he asked, his voice gruff but polite. I hesitated for a moment. "Just gas, thanks," I replied, not really needing anything more. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, and I definitely wasn't in the mood for anyone poking around my car. The man seemed unfazed by my curt response and took a few steps closer, his smile never wavering. "You sure? I can check your tires for you. It's always good to make sure everything's in shape, especially when you're out here on your own." I glanced at the car. The tires were fine. I wasn't worried about them, but something about his offer felt off. There was a little too much insistence in his voice, like he was trying to convince me that I needed his help. I shook my head and gave a polite but firm smile. "No, that's all right. I've got it covered. Thanks, though." The man didn't seem put off by my refusal. He nodded slowly and shuffled back toward the station's entrance, still smiling. I couldn't help but watch him as he walked away. Something about his demeanor made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just my overactive imagination at work. I was probably just tired from the long drive. After fueling up, I went inside to use the restroom, briefly glancing at the man who was now sitting on a stool behind the counter, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine. The interior of the station was dimly lit, and it had that old, musty smell that reminded me of places that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. I used the bathroom quickly and returned to my car, ready to get back on the road. The whole stop had taken no more than 15 minutes, but as I slid into the driver's seat, something immediately struck me as wrong. I glanced at my tires, and that's when I noticed that every single one of my tire caps was missing. It was a subtle change, but unmistakable. The metal valve stems were now bare, shining dully in the fading light. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the tires, unsure of what I was seeing. I stepped out of the car and walked around it, inspecting the other tires. Sure enough, the same thing had happened to all four. The caps were gone, leaving the tire valves exposed. I couldn't believe it. How had I not noticed it sooner? Had someone taken them while I was inside? The man had offered to check my tires. Was that just an excuse to get close to my car? Panic set in as I ran my fingers over the exposed valves. What was the point of stealing just the tire caps? I could feel my pulse quicken. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, but I wasn't sure what to do. Should I confront the man inside the gas station, or call the police? I went back to the station, my mind racing. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the man behind the counter looked up from his magazine. His smile was gone now, replaced by that same distant, vacant stare. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just out at my car, and I noticed something strange. All four of my tire caps are missing." The man didn't seem surprised. He just stared at me for a moment, as though processing the information, and then he gave a slow nod. "I see. Well, that happens sometimes out here. People take stuff. You might want to check the parking lot for anything unusual." His response was so casual, so nonchalant, it made my stomach churn. It felt like he wasn't bothered by the theft at all, like it was a common occurrence. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. "I don't think it's normal for people to steal tire caps," I said, more firmly this time. "Did you see anyone near my car while I was inside?" The man's gaze shifted slightly. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me feel like he wasn't telling the whole truth. "I don't know," he said with a shrug. I wasn't really paying attention. That was all I needed to hear. I knew then that he had seen something, he just wasn't willing to admit it. Something wasn't right, and it felt like I was being toyed with. I walked back to my car, and without further hesitation, I took my keys out of the ignition and locked the doors. I wasn't about to stay any longer at that gas station. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave fast. The man had given me a bad vibe from the start, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that he was involved in whatever had happened to my tires. I pulled out of the gas station, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man or someone else following me. My mind was still racing with questions. Who would take tire caps? What was the point? And why did the man seem so unfazed by it all? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. That gas station was too isolated, too strange. I wasn't sure if I had just narrowly avoided something worse, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The road stretched out before me, and I pushed the pedal to the floor, eager to put as much distance between myself and that strange, lonely place as I could. Story 25. I woke up to the faint but persistent sound of water dripping. My eyes slowly opened, and as my surroundings came into focus, the early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. The sound of dripping water continued, which was strange because I hadn't left any taps running. With a groan, I pushed myself up from bed and walked toward the bathroom, wiping sleep from my eyes. I was still groggy, my head foggy from the night's rest. I swung the bathroom door open, and as I stepped inside, I froze. The mirror, usually clear and unassuming, was fogged up, but it wasn't from steam. There were words written on it. Bold and unmistakable. "Don't ignore me." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the writing. The message was clear, yet utterly perplexing. There was no marker or pen in sight, nothing that could explain how the words appeared on the mirror. It felt wrong, unsettling, as though the message had been left for me, but by who? Or what? My heart began to pound in my chest, and I instinctively stepped closer to the mirror. My hands reached for it, trembling slightly as I ran my fingers across the fog. The words were smudged by my touch, but they didn't disappear. It was as if they had been etched there in some way that didn't require any physical writing tool. I pulled my hand away, unsure of what I was seeing. My eyes scanned the rest of the bathroom. Everything was exactly as it should be. No signs of a struggle, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened the night before. I glanced around the bathroom again, checking for any clues. The bathroom window was shut, and the small fan that usually ran to clear the steam after showers was silent. The only other thing that caught my attention was the faint scent of something metallic in the air, almost like copper, but that too was fleeting, and I couldn't place it. I thought about it for a moment, but quickly brushed the thought away, focusing instead on the writing that still stared back at me. "I don't ignore me," I repeated aloud to myself, trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I lived alone, and I was sure no one had been in my apartment last night. I double-checked the locks before going to bed, and everything had been in order. So how could this have happened? Who could have possibly written this? The confusion, mixed with a growing unease, started to gnaw at me. I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing. There were no markers or pens anywhere in the bathroom, and it didn't seem like the type of writing that could have been made with a finger in steam. It almost looked as if it had been drawn with something far more deliberate, Yet there was nothing. Not a single trace of ink, pencil, or any substance that could have left such a message. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but everything about this felt wrong. I turned around and left the bathroom, trying to shake off the unease. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping that a cup of coffee would calm my racing thoughts. As the hot liquid poured into the mug, I couldn't stop replaying the message over and over in my mind. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't something I could rationalize away. Something or someone had left that message specifically for me, and I couldn't ignore it literally or figuratively. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, checking messages, and looking at the time. It was early. Too early to be dealing with something this unsettling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. I thought about calling someone, but who could I even explain this to? Who would believe me? After all, the only physical evidence was a message on a bathroom mirror that made no sense. After several minutes of pacing back and forth, I decided I needed to go back in and inspect the bathroom again. My mind was filled with questions, none of which I could answer. As I walked back into the bathroom, I hesitated, then reached for the mirror once more. This time I wiped at the fog with the edge of my sleeve, expecting the message to be gone. But it wasn't. It was still there, clearer than before, staring back at me like some kind of cruel joke. I stared at the words, my chest tight with anxiety. Who could have done this, and why? I was gripped by a growing sense of fear, not just because of the strange message, but because it seemed impossible. I couldn't have imagined it. The writing was real, but it didn't make sense. No one else had been in my apartment. I hadn't heard anything unusual in the night, and the weird scent from earlier, I couldn't even identify it. I stood there for a few minutes, my mind searching for an explanation, but I couldn't find one. Every answer I came up with seemed more ridiculous than the last. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I was hallucinating, or perhaps I had left the mirror fogged up without remembering it. But none of those explanations could explain the words themselves or the way they had appeared without any discernible source. The minutes stretched on, and my sense of reality began to feel distorted. My reflection in the mirror started to look strange, almost like it was a little too sharp, too defined, as though something else was watching me through it. My heart skipped a beat, and I stepped back from the mirror. The feeling that I was being observed became overwhelming, but when I turned around to look at the room behind me, there was nothing there. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was or how to stop it. My fear began to escalate, a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, desperate to talk to someone, but before the call could connect, I heard a noise from inside the bathroom. I froze, my pulse racing. It wasn't the sound of the mirror fogging up again or a door creaking. It was a soft scraping sound, like something lightly brushing against glass. I turned quickly, my eyes wide with terror, but the bathroom was still silent. My phone call was answered, and I could hear my friend's voice on the line, but all I could focus on was the overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. Something was in the room with me, watching, waiting. "Hello? Are you okay?" my friend asked, but I couldn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the bathroom mirror, where the writing now seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. It was as though the words were moving, shifting, begging for my attention. The feeling of being trapped, of being watched, was unbearable. I slammed the bathroom door shut and leaned against it, still holding my phone, the sound of my friend's voice barely registering in my ears. The writing on the mirror wasn't just a warning, it was a demand. A demand I didn't know how to ignore anymore. Story 26. It was a typical evening when I found myself walking back to my apartment after a long day at work. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant hum of city life. As I neared the entrance to my building, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was an older model sedan, dark in color, with tinted windows. What struck me immediately was the figure inside, sitting in the driver's seat, bent over a notebook, scribbling something. I couldn't quite see the details of what he was writing, but it seemed like he was in the middle of something important. At first, I didn't think much of it. People sometimes parked on this street, either waiting for someone or just taking a break. But there was something about the way the man kept glancing up at me, his eyes barely visible behind the tint of the windows, that made me uneasy. Each time I looked in his direction, his gaze seemed to follow me, but just for a moment before he would return to his notebook. I picked up my pace, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as a cold sensation crept up my spine. It wasn't so much the fact that he was staring, but the way he did it, subtle, almost calculated. I reached the entrance of my building and fumbled with my keys, trying to get the door open as quickly as possible. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the man still there, writing in his notebook, pausing every few seconds to look at me again. It was as if he was tracking my movements. The street lamp above me flickered, casting strange shadows that only heightened the sense of being watched. I finally got the door open and stepped inside, feeling a small relief, but the uneasy feeling didn't dissipate. I made my way up to my apartment, but my mind kept returning to the man in the car. I tried to brush it off as my overactive imagination. It was possible he was just waiting for someone, or maybe he was working on something that required focus. Still, the way he kept watching me felt strange. Why hadn't he gotten out of the car? Why hadn't he left once I had passed by? Once inside my apartment, I locked the door behind me, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. I went about my usual routine, cooking dinner and settling onto the couch to unwind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been waiting for me. His behavior wasn't normal, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had been there longer than I had noticed. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but every so often, my eyes would flick to the window. I half expected to see him still sitting in his car, watching. Later that evening, as the sun set and the streets grew quieter, I decided to go out again to grab some groceries. I didn't think much of it until I stepped out onto the sidewalk and noticed the same car parked across the street. This time, however, it was empty. The man was gone. My first instinct was relief. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing, and now he had left for good. But there was still something about the situation that didn't sit right with me. I continued on my way, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few steps, I turned my head, half expecting to see the man lurking in the shadows. When I reached the store and stepped inside, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. The street outside was quiet, and the car was still gone, but the sense of unease remained. It was like the whole encounter had planted a seed of suspicion in my mind that refused to go away. The next few days passed without incident, and I tried to forget about the man in the car. But each time I walked past the spot where he had parked, I found myself glancing nervously at the empty space. I started to wonder if he would show up again, or if he had been there for a reason I couldn't understand. It didn't help that my apartment had a clear view of the street, and every time I looked out the window, my gaze inevitably drifted to the spot where his car had been. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was no real reason to worry, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. Then, one afternoon, as I was sitting on my couch, A knock came at the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing but the hallway outside. Cautiously, I opened the door just a crack, enough to see if anyone was standing there. To my surprise, there was nothing, just an envelope lying on the floor. My pulse quickened as I bent down to pick it up, my mind racing. The envelope was unmarked, and there was no return address. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. On it, in neat handwriting, was a message: "I see you." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I stood there, staring at the words, my mind struggling to process them. Who had left this? Why? I could feel my hands shaking as I held the paper. The message was simple, yet chilling, and it only fueled the growing paranoia I had felt ever since the man in the car had been watching me. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I ran through every possibility in my mind. Who would leave me a note like that? And why did it feel so personal, so intentional? I couldn't shake the thought that it was connected to the man in the car. It was too coincidental. Maybe he had followed me, watched me closely enough to know where I lived. Maybe he had been watching me long before I had even noticed. I decided then that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to take action to protect myself. I called a friend and asked if they could stay with me for a while, just in case. The creeping dread I felt made me uneasy about being alone in the apartment anymore. The strange man, his presence, and now the note, everything about the situation felt like an intrusion. Whoever had been watching me wasn't just some random stranger. They had a purpose, and I had no idea what it was. Story 27. I had just finished a long day of work and was looking forward to relaxing at home. The evening sun cast a warm glow across the neighborhood as I walked to the mailbox. It was the kind of quiet, peaceful evening where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As I reached my mailbox, I noticed something strange, an unmarked package sitting right at the edge of the mail slot. I frowned, confused. There had been no notice of a delivery, no indication that I was expecting anything. It wasn't typical for packages to arrive without a return address, especially not in such a discreet manner. My fingers brushed against the brown paper wrapping, its texture smooth but strangely cold. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should open it right there or wait until I was inside. Curiosity won out, and I brought the package inside with me. Once inside my apartment, I set the package on the kitchen counter and examined it more closely. It was a simple rectangular box about the size of a small book. There were no markings, no labels, nothing to indicate where it had come from or who had sent it. A sense of unease began to settle in, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I carefully cut open the tape and peeled back the flaps, revealing the contents. My breath caught in my throat. Inside the box, neatly folded, was a wig. A synthetic wig with hair that looked identical to my own, my exact shade, length, and style. The strands were soft and shiny, as if they had just been brushed, and the wig itself looked almost too perfect. My stomach churned as I held it up, running my fingers through the strands. It was unnerving to see something so personal, so specific to me, sitting in the box, as if someone had been watching me, studying my appearance. I set the wig down on the counter and took a few steps back, my heart racing. Who would send me something like this? I had no enemies, no reason to believe anyone would want to frighten me. My thoughts were a blur as I tried to make sense of the situation. Had it been a joke? A prank? But who would have gone to the trouble of sending something so elaborate, something that felt so deliberate? I took a few deep breaths to calm myself. There had to be a reasonable explanation, I told myself. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had meant to send it to someone else. I checked the package again, looking for any hint of a name or address, but there was nothing. No indication of who might have sent it. My mind raced as I considered the possibilities. Like it'd be a stranger who had somehow gotten a hold of my information. Had someone been watching me? I grabbed my phone and called my friend Sarah. I needed someone to talk to, someone to help make sense of the situation. She answered after a few rings. "Hey, what's up?" I could hear the sound of her voice, calm and cheerful, but I felt far from calm. I explained the situation, telling her about the unmarked package and the wig. She was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her processing the information. "That's really weird," she finally said. "I mean, why would someone send you that? Do you know anyone who could be messing with you?" I shook my head, though I knew she couldn't see me. "I don't think so. It feels too personal. It's my exact hairstyle, Sarah. I can't explain it. It's like they've been watching me." Sarah paused again. "I think you should call the police just to be safe. This sounds like it could be something more than just a prank." I hesitated. It felt extreme, but the feeling of being watched, the dread building inside me, made it hard to ignore. "I'll think about it, but I'll be careful. I'm not sure what to do right now." We talked a little longer, but I could tell Sarah was concerned. After hanging up, I sat there staring at the wig on the counter, my mind swirling. What was the sender's intention? What did it mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something far more sinister than a simple joke. It was as if someone had gotten too close, too personal, and had decided to send me a reminder of their presence. I spent the next few hours pacing around my apartment, unable to focus on anything. The wig kept haunting my thoughts, and the more I thought about it, the more the idea of someone observing me felt real. It wasn't just that the wig looked like my hairstyle, it was the precision, the thoughtfulness behind it. Whoever had sent it seemed to know more than just what I looked like. They seemed to know me in ways that I couldn't explain. Finally, I decided to try to put it out of my mind. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence and I was overreacting. I locked the wig away in a drawer, hoping that would be the end of it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing small noises from the hallway outside my apartment, the sound of footsteps that seemed to stop just outside my door. Every time I turned on the lights to check, the hall was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of dread still hanging in the air. I felt like something was just out of reach. Something I couldn't quite see, but that was still there, lurking in the background. I tried to go about my day, but the unease never left me. I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, constantly aware of the shadows, the quiet moments that felt too still. It had been a few days since I received the package, but I still hadn't been able to shake the feeling that someone knew me far too well. Someone had been in my space, and the thought of it gnawed at me. No one else seemed to be taking it seriously, but to me, it felt like a warning. Someone was watching me, and I didn't know why. I couldn't bring myself to throw away the wig. It felt like a piece of something bigger, something I wasn't ready to understand. All I knew was that the sender wasn't finished, and I didn't know when or if they would ever stop. Story 28. I was spending my Saturday afternoon browsing through a clothing store in the mall. The store was quiet, with only a few other customers scattered around, carefully sifting through the racks. I didn't have any particular intention to buy anything, just passing time, letting the soft music and bright lighting distract me from the rest of the world. I picked up a light sweater, draped it over my arm, and wandered deeper into the store. That's when he appeared, a man in his early 40s wearing a dark jacket and a too friendly smile. He seemed to materialize from nowhere, standing next to me with an odd intensity in his eyes. He wasn't particularly tall, but there was something unnerving about the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. "That sweater looks great," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "I'd be happy to buy it for you if you want." I glanced at him, a little thrown off by his sudden appearance and unsolicited offer. "No, thank you. I'm just looking," I replied, trying to sound polite but firm. I figured he was just trying to be nice, but something about the way he had approached me felt wrong, like I was the subject of some strange experiment. I turned away and continued browsing through the clothes, hoping he would take the hint and leave me alone. But he didn't leave. Instead, he followed me, just a few paces behind, as I moved toward the other side of the store. I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against my back, but I didn't look at him. I picked up another shirt, pretending to study the fabric, but I could sense him hovering nearby, watching my every move. It was as if he was waiting for me to change my mind. "Are you sure? You'd look amazing in that," he said again, his voice too casual, too familiar. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I quickly put the shirt back on the rack. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in a conversation with someone who clearly didn't respect boundaries. I tried to shake it off, but I felt his gaze following me even as I moved to another part of the store. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him still there, standing by the sweater rack, watching me from a distance. His eyes were not friendly anymore, but almost predatory, like he was trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable under his gaze. His smile, which had seemed harmless at first, was now stretched too thin, like he was trying too hard to convince me to take him up on his offer. I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't explain why, but I just felt this creeping sense of unease that wouldn't go away. I turned toward the exit, my hand wrapped around the sweater I had picked up earlier, and made my way toward the door. But as soon as I reached the threshold, I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned just in time to see him following me, still a few steps behind, his eyes locked on mine. His pace had quickened, and I could feel the tension in the air as he closed the gap between us. My heart began to race, and I picked up the pace, suddenly desperate to get out of there. I pushed open the door to the store and stepped into the busy mall corridor, hoping the crowd would provide some sense of safety. But when I glanced back over my shoulder, the man was still there, following me through the mall. His pace was deliberate, unhurried, as though he wasn't trying to catch up to me but simply keeping his distance. The weirdest part was how normal it all seemed to him, how unaffected he was by the obvious discomfort I was feeling. I walked faster, weaving through the crowds of people, trying to lose him in the sea of shoppers. The mall was crowded now, but no matter how fast I moved or how many turns I made, he was always behind me, just a few steps away. My chest tightened as I began to feel trapped, cornered in the open space. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Eventually, I made my way toward the escalators, hoping to lose him by going to a different level of the mall. But when I glanced back, I saw him following me toward the stairs, his eyes never leaving me. At this point, the entire situation felt surreal, as if I were in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't make sense of his behavior. Why was he doing this? I reached the second floor and kept walking, my mind racing, trying to think of a way out of this. I needed help, but I didn't know who to turn to. My phone was buried in the bottom of my purse, and I hadn't thought to call security. I kept walking, trying not to panic, hoping he would just leave me alone. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him, his presence looming just a few feet away, like a shadow I couldn't escape. It was then that I made another decision. I needed to confront him. I couldn't keep running forever, and I didn't want to feel like a victim anymore. I stopped in the middle of the walkway, turned around, and faced him. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling but firm. "Why are you following me?" For a moment he didn't respond, just stood there with that unnerving smile on his face. Then, slowly, he took a step toward me, his expression unreadable. "I just want to help you," he said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing. "You don't have to be so suspicious. I can make things easier for you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There was something about the way he said it, something in the calmness of his tone, that made it clear he didn't understand how disturbing his actions were. His words sounded like manipulation, like he was trying to talk me into trusting him, but I wasn't buying it. "I don't need your help," I said, my voice shaking less now as I stepped back. "I don't want anything from you." He didn't say anything more. Instead, he just stood there watching me. I turned and walked away again, this time with determination. I didn't look back. My heart was still pounding, but I was done with being passive. I knew I had to get to safety. I made my way quickly toward the nearest exit, my hands shaking as I pushed open the door. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool air hitting my face like a slap of reality. I looked around, but the man was gone. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my breath, before finally calling a friend to come pick me up. I didn't want to be alone anymore. The mall felt too big, too cold, and too full of hidden eyes. I'd never expected something so ordinary, a simple shopping trip, to turn into a nightmare I couldn't shake. Story 29. It was a typical Tuesday when I found the old phone in my mailbox. The small, worn-out device was buried beneath a pile of letters and a few catalogs. At first, I thought it was just a forgotten piece of junk someone had left behind. It wasn't a model I recognized, not something you typically see in stores anymore, old, bulky, with a cracked screen. I picked it up, wondering who would leave such a thing in my mailbox. My curiosity piqued. I slipped the phone into my pocket and went inside to figure out what was going on. I sat at my kitchen table, my fingers hesitating over the phone's buttons. It looked so outdated that I had to press a few buttons just to get the screen to turn on. The phone buzzed to life, and immediately, a notification popped up, one missed call. No number. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. Who would call me from an unknown number on such an old device? Maybe it was some kind of prank. But then I noticed another notification, one voicemail. I hesitated. The silence in the room felt thick, like something was waiting. Slowly, I pressed the voicemail icon. The phone let out a soft click before a recording started to play. At first, there was nothing, just the deep, unsettling sound of heavy breathing. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was holding the phone too close to their face, trying to remain unnoticed. The breath was ragged, like the person on the other end was struggling to control their airways, but it wasn't panicked. It was calm, too calm. I clenched my jaw, staring at the screen. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, each inhale and exhale weighing heavier on me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take the silence any longer, I heard something, a faint whisper. It wasn't loud, barely audible over the steady breathing. But it was enough. My name. Allah. I froze. The voice wasn't familiar, but it felt wrong. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. The whisper, so soft, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something so intimate about it, like the person on the other end knew me too well. They'd been watching me, waiting for this moment. I immediately hung up, but my heart continued to race. I stared at the phone for a few moments, unsure of what to do next. My fingers trembled as I unlocked my own phone, hoping to find something that could explain the strange message. But nothing stood out, no missed calls, no strange voicemails. I couldn't shake the image of the phone in my mailbox, left so carelessly, almost as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I looked around my apartment, the silence now feeling suffocating. The walls seemed to press in a little closer. I had no explanation for what I had just heard. No explanation for why my name was whispered by a voice I didn't recognize. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, maybe something left by one of my friends who liked to mess with me. But even as I told myself this, doubt lingered. The voice on the voicemail didn't sound playful. It sounded like it was part of something more sinister. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The phone sat on my nightstand, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the voicemail, those deep breaths, the sound of my name. I kept telling myself that it was just a weird coincidence, a strange prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. The next morning, I took the phone to work with me, unable to leave it behind. I kept thinking about it, the voice, the whisper. What if someone had been watching me? What if they were still out there, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known? It was a constant itch in my mind, nagging at me throughout the day. During my lunch break, I decided to do some research. I Googled the phone's make and model, but there was nothing useful. It was as if the phone didn't exist outside of the strange encounter I just had. The search results only returned links to outdated forums and old, forgotten phone manuals. There was nothing that made sense. That night, I sat in the same spot, staring at the phone once again. It was so quiet, too quiet, like the world outside had stopped. The streetlights flickered outside my window, casting long, wavering shadows. I thought about throwing the phone away, about getting rid of it once and for all. But a strange curiosity kept me from doing it. I needed to know. I needed to hear more. After what felt like an eternity, I pressed the voicemail icon again. This time I braced myself. The same heavy breathing filled the air, the sound of lungs struggling to keep control, but this time it was different. There was something in the sound of presence, a shift. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. And then a voice came through. My name again, Ella. But this time it was louder, more distinct. The voice was clearer, and there was a sense of something lurking behind it, something dark. It wasn't just a whisper this time. It was as though the voice was right beside me. A cold chill swept over me as I listened, unable to move, unable to look away. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. I wanted to throw the phone out the window, to destroy it, but I couldn't bring myself to. I kept listening, frozen in place. The heavy breathing continued, the voice now closer, right next to my ear. I know where you are, it whispered. I dropped the phone in a panic, my heart racing. My eyes shot around the room as if expecting someone to be standing behind me. But no one was there, only the shadows in the corners of the room and the thumping of my own pulse. I turned on all the lights in my apartment, trying to shake the fear, but the phone remained on the floor, still glowing, still alive. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. I had never given anyone my address. I didn't even remember putting up my mailbox flag that morning. Whoever had left that phone, whoever had whispered my name, was closer than I thought. Story 30. E. I had arrived at the hotel late, just as the last traces of daylight were slipping away, leaving behind the cold stillness of night. It had been a long day of travel, and I was eager to get some rest. The lobby was quiet, with only a few guests lingering around, but the staff behind the desk greeted me with the kind of polite indifference that comes with late-night shifts. I grabbed my key and headed to my room, relieved to be out of the hustle and bustle of the city. The room was exactly what I expected, small, simple, and functional. I took a quick shower to wash off the fatigue of the day and threw myself onto the bed. The comforter was soft, and the pillows were plush, inviting sleep with their warmth. I set my alarm for an early morning meeting and closed my eyes, trying to push away the thoughts of work that kept swirling in my mind. After a few moments, I finally drifted off, the sounds of the hotel's air conditioning lulling me into a deep slumber. It was a sharp knock at the door that woke me. The sound echoed through the quiet room, startling me from my sleep. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe it was a passing guest or the cleaning staff taking care of a neighboring room. But then came the knock again, louder this time, more insistent. I groggily checked the clock on the nightstand. It was 3 a.m. I sat up in bed, confused. Why would someone be knocking at this hour? My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was just someone with bad timing, or maybe someone had mistaken my room for another. But the knock came again, followed by a voice from the other side of the door. "Housekeeping," the voice called out. "Just checking to see if you need anything." My heart skipped a beat. Housekeeping at 3 a.m. I couldn't think of a single reason why someone would be cleaning rooms at this hour. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I wasn't expecting any room service, and I certainly hadn't requested anything that would warrant a late-night visit. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Something didn't sit right about the situation. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there, just a dimly lit hallway stretching out in both directions. My pulse quickened as I took a step back, my mind racing. I didn't recognize the voice from the other side, and it struck me as odd that the person would simply knock and leave without offering any further explanation. I wasn't about to open the door to a stranger at this hour. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and quickly dialed the front desk, hoping to get some clarification. The phone rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. "Front desk, how may I help you?" I explained the situation to the clerk, telling them that someone had knocked on my door claiming to be from housekeeping. I asked if they had sent anyone up to my room, and the clerk's response was immediate. "No, we haven't sent anyone. All our housekeeping staff finished their rounds hours ago." "Are you sure it was housekeeping?" I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. Why had someone claimed to be housekeeping if they weren't even on staff? I told the clerk that I was certain the person had said they were from housekeeping and had knocked twice. The clerk paused for a moment, and then I heard the faint sound of typing in the background. "I'll send someone to check on it right away," the clerk said, their voice tight with concern. "Stay on the line until then." I hung up, my stomach in knots. It felt wrong, like I was in some sort of twisted game. I had already locked the door when the knock first came, but I double-checked it now, making sure the bolt was in place. The thought of opening the door to whoever had been on the other side seemed impossible. As I stood there in the dark, every creak and groan of the building made my heart race. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of footsteps in the hallway, but that was it. Another knock came this time, louder and more forceful than before. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my back against the door, not knowing what to do next. The voice came again, but this time it sounded different. There was no longer any politeness in the tone. "Open up," it commanded. "We know you're in there." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice stuck in my throat. I was paralyzed, standing in the dark, clutching the phone in my hand like a lifeline. The knock came again, but this time I couldn't bring myself to respond. Whoever it was on the other side, they were no longer pretending to be housekeeping. The desperation in their voice was unmistakable, and it sent waves of terror through me. I backed away from the door, my feet stumbling over the carpet, and grabbed the chair by the desk. I wedged it under the doorknob in a futile attempt to feel safer, though I knew it wouldn't hold for long if someone was truly trying to get in. My pulse raced, and my thoughts ran wild. What if they weren't just trying to get into my room? What if they were looking for something, or someone? Just as the panic began to take hold of me, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the door, hurried and quick, as if someone was moving away. The air seemed to shift, and for a moment the entire building felt like it was holding its breath. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I heard another knock, this time softer, almost tentative. It was followed by silence. I picked up the phone again and dialed the front desk, my hands shaking. "Is someone coming?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the clerk responded immediately, their voice now full of urgency. "We've sent someone up. Stay inside and lock all your doors. Do not open the door for anyone else." I felt a small sense of relief at their words, but it was quickly overshadowed by the dread that still gripped me. Was the person who had knocked even really gone? Or had they been watching me the whole time, waiting for me to let my guard down? The minutes stretched on in eerie silence until I heard a firm knock at the door again, followed by a voice. "Security, we're here to check on you. Open up." I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But after everything that had happened, I didn't feel like I could trust anyone anymore. I stood frozen, the fear creeping into my every thought. Would I ever feel safe here again?